The Dowager Duchess slid $300 across the table and said, "Ruin my son." Clara Whitmore didn't flinch, didn't blink. She looked at the money, then at the most powerful woman in the Hudson Valley, and said the only thing an honest woman with a dying father and a collapsing church roof could say. "Tell me exactly how you want it done." She told herself it was survival. She almost believed it. She had no idea she had just walked into the only place she would ever truly belong. If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this travels. Now stay with me. Nothing goes the way anyone planned. Clara Whitmore had exactly one good dress, $12 to her name, and a father whose cough had gotten bad enough that she'd started counting his breaths at night when she thought he was asleep. She was 26 years old. She had been a governess 3 times and had been dismissed 3 times, once for correcting the family's son on the origin of the quadratic formula, once for telling a merchant's wife that her daughter did not have a learning deficiency. She had a teacher who didn't know how to teach, and once for refusing to tell a 12-year-old girl that her ambition to study law was inappropriate for a woman. Clara had been right all 3 times. It had not helped her employment record. She was between positions, which was a dignified way of saying she was desperate when the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday in late June, delivered by a rider she didn't recognize on a horse that cost more than her father's church. The envelope was heavy cream paper sealed in dark wax and smelled faintly of rosewater and something cooler beneath it. Something that had no name, but that Clara, who had learned to read rooms the way other women read novels, recognized immediately as power. She broke the seal. She read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the steps of her father's porch and read it a 3rd time, because the first 2 times she'd been certain she misunderstood. She had not misunderstood. The Dowager Duchess, Eleanor Ashford, of Ashford Manor, Hudson River Valley, was requesting her presence. Not for a governess position. Not for any employment Clara had a name for. The letter was precise and impersonal, and gave almost nothing away. But what it gave away was enough a matter of some delicacy, requiring a woman of intelligence and discretion, compensation to be discussed in person, travel arrangements provided. Clara folded the letter. She went inside. She looked at her father, who was sitting at his desk, correcting Sunday's sermon, with the careful, slow movements of a man who had learned to ration his energy because he didn't have as much of it as he once did. The window above his desk let in the afternoon light, and through it she could see the corner of the church roof where the canvas patch they'd put up in April had already started to peel back at one edge. "Papa," she said. He looked up. He had her eyes dark, direct, slightly too observant for social comfort. "You have your problem face on," he said. "I have a letter," she said. She showed it to him. He read it once slowly, and then he set it down on his desk and looked at it for a moment, the way he looked at theology problems that didn't resolve neatly. "Eleanor Ashford," he said. "You know her." "I know of her," he said. "She married into the Ashford title 40 years ago. Before that," he paused. "I'm not certain anyone remembers where she came from. She doesn't encourage the subject. Do you think I should go?" Her father looked at her over his reading glasses. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are 26 years old and smarter than almost anyone I've ever met, and that the roof has 3 holes in it, and that I trust your judgment." It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was her father's way of telling her he believed she already knew the answer and didn't need him to give it to her. She left for Ashford Manor on Thursday morning. The hired wagon deposited her at the iron gate at 10:30, and Clara stood in the summer heat with her single traveling bag and looked up at the house and understood immediately why people came to places like this and lost themselves. It wasn't the size, though it was enormous. It was the weight of it, the way everything from the stone to the landscaping communicated without a single word that the people inside had never once had to wonder if they would be all right. She had spent her entire life wondering if they would be all right. She picked up her bag and walked to the front door and knocked because she hadn't been able to find the east entrance, and she refused to wander around the outside of a building looking for a servant's door when she wasn't a servant. The housekeeper. Mrs. Aldrich opened the door and assessed her in 4 seconds with the practiced efficiency of a woman who categorized people for a living. Clara could see the calculation happening in real time. The dress is clean, but old. The bag is small. The posture is better than expected. The face is. Mrs. Aldrich's expression shifted very slightly, recalibrating. Clara had that effect on people sometimes. They expected one thing from the way she looked and got another from the way she stood. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Aldrich said. "Good morning," Clara said. "I came to the front. I hope that's acceptable." From the brief pause before Mrs. Aldrich stepped back, Clara understood that it was not entirely acceptable. She stepped inside anyway. The Dowager Duchess did not keep her waiting long, only 7 minutes, which Clara spent memorizing the sitting room and concluding that it had been designed to make visitors feel small, without being able to identify exactly how it accomplished this. When Eleanor Ashford entered, Clara understood. The room hadn't been designed to make visitors feel small. It had been designed to suit the woman who walked into it. Eleanor Ashford, at 61, was the most composed human being Clara had ever encountered. Not cold, composed. There was a difference, though it took a moment to feel it. Cold was absence. This was something controlled so tightly and for so long that it had become indistinguishable from the original. She sat without invitation and looked at Clara with gray eyes that gave nothing away, and Clara looked back with dark eyes that gave very little away. And for a moment, the room held two women taking each other's full measure. "Miss Whitmore," Eleanor said, "you came to the front door." "I couldn't find the east entrance," Clara said. "The east entrance is clearly marked." "Perhaps to people who already know where it is," Clara said pleasantly. Another beat. Something moved in Eleanor's expression, not displeasure, not amusement. Recognition almost. The kind that comes before you decide whether to acknowledge what you've recognized. "I'll speak plainly," Eleanor said. "I'd appreciate that," Clara said. "My son," Eleanor said, "is 30 years old, holds one of the most significant estates in New York State, and is in danger of making the worst decision of his life." "What decision?" "He intends to marry for love." Clara waited, certain there was more. There was not. That was apparently the whole of the crisis. I see, Clara said carefully. "I don't believe you do," Eleanor said. "He has refused every suitable match I have presented him over the past 3 years. Every family of appropriate standing, every woman of correct breeding and education. He refuses them all on the same grounds." She paused, and the pause carried 40 years of carefully maintained walls. "He does not feel a genuine connection." "That sounds like a man with standards," Clara said. "That sounds like a man who has been reading too many novels," Eleanor said. "He has developed the notion that marriage ought to be built on some form of emotional authenticity." She said it the way someone might say structural damage or poor harvest. A problem. A condition to be corrected. "And you want me to correct it," Clara said. "I want you to cure it," Eleanor said. "I am going to introduce you to Gabriel as a prospective bride. You will stay here for 2 weeks. You will be presented in society. You will attend Dinners Assemblies Church. And during those 2 weeks," she held Clara's eyes, "you will be exactly who you are, Miss Whitmore. Your speech, your manner, your background. No performance, no effort to charm, no attempt to appear other than you are. You will demonstrate to my son as clearly and completely as possible that a woman of your origins and disposition is entirely unsuitable as a Duchess of Ashford." The room was very quiet. Clara heard herself say it before she finished deciding to, "You want me to be a lesson." "I want to protect my son from a mistake," Eleanor said. "You are the method." "And in exchange, $300, Eleanor said. "Paid in full at the end of 2 weeks. $300. The number sat in the room between them like a physical thing, and Clara looked at it and saw layered beneath it her father at his desk in the morning light, the canvas patch peeling away from the church roof, the sound of his breathing at night. "There is one condition," Eleanor said. "Gabriel cannot know. He must believe this is a natural introduction. If he discovers the arrangement, the agreement is void." "You want me to lie to him," Clara said. "I want you to protect him," Eleanor said. "The distinction matters." Clara did not believe the distinction mattered. She believed they were the same thing wearing different clothes. But she looked at Eleanor Ashford's composed face and her folded hands, and she noticed because she always noticed the way Eleanor's left thumb pressed hard into the back of her right hand. Pressing and pressing, slow and rhythmic. An old habit. The kind you developed when you had been afraid for a very long time and had run out of other ways to hold it. She filed that away. She would think about it later. "All right," Clara said. "I'll do it." Eleanor nodded. She had Clara understood, never doubted she would. She was given a room on the third floor that was comfortable and entirely impersonal, and she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling and went through the logic of what she'd agreed to. The logic was simple. The morality was not. She had agreed to deceive a man she hadn't met for money. She had agreed to walk into his life and perform inadequacy so thoroughly that he would be cured of wanting anyone like her. The practical part of her mind, the part that had been running her family's accounts since she was 14, said this was the only option. The other part of her mind, smaller and less reasonable, said she ought to at least meet the man before she decided who was wrong for whom. She would meet him at dinner. She had 3 hours. She spent them unpacking her single bag, repairing a small tear in the collar of her second-best blouse, and reading the grammatical error carved into the Ashford family motto above the library door, which she had noticed on her way upstairs, and which was, she was almost certain, a mistake that had been there long enough that no one saw it anymore. She thought about that for a while. About things that stayed wrong so long they stopped being noticed. Gabriel Ashford was already in the dining room when she came down, and he was standing near the window doing the thing that Clara recognized immediately as the specific behavior of a person who needed to be doing something with his hands in order to feel like he was allowed to exist in a room. He was holding a glass of water he wasn't drinking. He turned when she entered. Clara's mind did the thing it always did. Rapid involuntary assessment, the way her father had trained her to see people instead of categories. The portrait in the hallway had shown a duke. The man by the window was the thing beneath the duke, barely contained inside the performance of it. Handsome in the way that good bones and daily writing produced, but the face behind the handsomeness was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the exhaustion of a man who had been required every single day to be exactly what a room needed him to be, and who had done it so long he could no longer remember what he wanted to be instead. Her father had that look sometimes on the days when he'd spent 12 hours being what the congregation needed and had nothing left for himself. She knew that look. She realized in the space of 3 seconds a great deal of sympathy for it. Careful, she told herself. You are here to be a lesson, not to feel sorry for the student. Miss Whitmore, Gabriel said, and crossed the room with his hand extended. Gabriel Ashford, my mother mentioned you'd be joining us. He smiled, warm, practiced, calibrated perfectly for a first meeting. She tells me you've come from near Dalton. About 4 miles east of the village, Clara said, shaking his hand. My father's parish, very small. You've almost certainly never heard of it. I find small places are often more interesting than large ones, he said. It was a perfectly pleasant thing to say. The kind of thing a man with good manners said to make a person from a small place feel valued. Clara looked at him for a moment. Do you actually believe that, she said? Or is it something you say because it's kind? The smile stayed on his face, but something behind it shifted like a latch releasing. He looked at her with a different quality of attention. Not the performance attention of a man being polite to company. Something more awake than that. That's a direct question, he said. I tend toward them, she said. Your mother didn't warn you. She warned me you were unconventional. Did she say it the way people say unconventional when they mean unsuitable? A pause. Then, with what sounded like genuine surprise at his own honesty, yes. I appreciate the candor, Clara said. She glanced past him toward the corridor where she'd seen the library door ajar on her way in. You have a water stain on your library ceiling, east wall near the corner. It's been there at least 1 full season if the staining pattern is right. He stared at her. If the beam above it is already softening, you're looking at a much larger repair than a roof patch, she said. My father's church had the same problem. We ignored it too long. Lost a full section. A moment of complete stillness, and then Gabriel Ashford laughed. Not the polished version. Not the performance. A real laugh, short and startled, that left him looking for just a second, like someone who had forgotten he was a duke. "You've been in this house 20 minutes, he said, "and your first observation was about my roof." "It was the most urgent thing I noticed," Clara said. "Should I have started with something more flattering?" "Everyone else does," he said. "I know," Clara said. "That's probably why the roof still leaks." He looked at her. And Clara, who had spent her whole life reading the things people couldn't hide, saw something in his face that she had not expected and was not prepared for. Relief. Gente. Dinner was Eleanor's performance, and she ran it with the smooth, invisible control of a woman who had orchestrated rooms for 40 years. The magistrate's wife, Mrs. Hale, asked about Clara's family with the specific, bright attention of someone collecting information for later use. Clara answered exactly as she was a minister's father. A mother dead since Clara was 14, 3 younger brothers. She'd helped raise a library of 200 books that was the most valuable thing the Whitmore family owned. "Books," said Mrs. Hale, in the tone of someone confirming a disappointment. "Books," Clara confirmed. "And you've worked as a governess," Mrs. Hale pressed. "3 times, Clara said, "and been dismissed 3 times. The table's attention sharpened. Eleanor's expression remained perfectly pleasant. Gabriel at the far end of the table went very still. "3 dismissals, Mrs. Hale said. "My goodness. What was the cause?" "The first family dismissed me for telling their son the quadratic formula was Arabic in origin, not French," Clara said. "He told his tutor I was impertinent. The second family dismissed me for suggesting their daughter didn't have a learning deficiency. She had a teacher who didn't know how to teach. The third family dismissed me for encouraging their 12-year-old daughter's interest in law." Complete silence. "I was right all 3 times, Clara added. "It hasn't been a comfort." And then, from Gabriel's end of the table, a sound that Eleanor had almost certainly not heard from her son in a very long time. Genuine laughter. Brief, swallowed fast, but real. Mrs. Hale looked at him, then at Clara, then at Eleanor, whose expression had not changed at all, and whose thumb was pressing steadily into the back of her hand beneath the table where no one but Clara could see it. After dinner. When the guests had gone, and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Clara went looking for the library. She found it. She also found Gabriel standing inside with a book in one hand and the look of a man who had not expected to be interrupted in the one room of his house where he allowed himself to be alone. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't realize anyone was here." "I come here most evenings," he said. He looked at the book, then at her. "Do you want me to leave?" "It's your library." "That isn't what I asked." Clara looked past him at the room, the walls of books, the 2 armchairs by the cold fireplace, the desk buried under papers, the lamp burning low. She looked up at the ceiling and found the water stain immediately pale and spreading at the junction of the east wall. "You should have that looked at," she said. "So you've said." "I'll keep saying it until it's fixed," she said. "What are you reading?" He held up the spine. Marcus Aurelius. Clara felt something move in her chest before she could stop it, a small, involuntary warmth. "My father reads a passage from that every morning," she said. "Before anything else. He says it's cheaper than a doctor and more reliable than a sermon." She paused. "He means his own sermons. He's very clear-eyed about his limitations." "He sounds unusual," Gabriel said. "He's the best man I've ever known," Clara said, simply without performance. "The world has fewer of those than it pretends. When you find one, you say so." Gabriel was quiet. He looked at her with that same awake attention from the dining room, and Clara noticed, because she always noticed, that he was standing slightly differently than he had at dinner. Less managed, less arranged. "You said earlier," he said, "that everyone starts with flattery." "They do. Why don't you?" She considered telling him a comfortable version of the truth. She gave him the real one instead. "Because I can't afford to," she said. "When you don't have money or position, the only thing you own outright is your honesty. If you spend that on flattery, you have nothing left." He was quiet for a moment. "That's..." He stopped. "I've never heard anyone say that." Most people with money don't have to think about it, she said. And people without money, they know exactly what everything costs, Clara said, including words. The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the summer dark pressed at the windows. Gabriel Ashford stood in his own library and looked at Clara Whitmore, the woman his mother had sent to embarrass him, who had instead told him his roof was leaking and his priorities were wrong, and that honesty was the only currency that couldn't be devalued. And he looked like a man who had just heard the lock on something click open that he had given up expecting to open. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "may I ask you something?" "You may ask," she said. "I'll tell you if I'd rather not answer." "Why did you come here truthfully?" The question landed with weight. The honest answer, the full one, rose up in her throat and pressed against her teeth, and Clara made the choice she would lie awake. Regretting later, she gave him the true thing that wasn't the whole truth. "My father's church needs a new roof," she said. "I needed the income." He nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer." "I try for honesty," she said. "I'm not always successful." He held her gaze. "Is there more to it than that?" "There's always more to everything," she said. "That's the part that's true right now." He accepted that. He shouldn't have, Clara thought. But he did, and she was both relieved and ashamed of the relief. By the third morning, she had mapped the house the way she mapped every place she lived. Not the formal rooms, but the real ones. The kitchen where Bess the cook held court from 5 in the morning until 8 at night, and considered the well-being of every person in the house her personal territory. The back corridor, where the groundskeeper's son was attempting with total seriousness and no success to teach a barn cat to sit. The east, upstairs, where the fourth floorboard from the left creaked so loudly in the small hours that she could track Gabriel's footsteps on the nights he couldn't sleep. He couldn't sleep often, more than his household seemed to notice. She noticed. She also noticed the way he moved through his estate, greeting every worker by name, asking after children and harvests and sick relatives, remembering the details of conversations from months ago. She noticed that none of them seemed to understand. He did this not because it was expected of a good master, but because it was the only part of his day when someone spoke to him as though he were a person rather than a position. On the fourth morning, she came down early and found him in the kitchen, sitting at the long servants' table with a cup of coffee and a ledger, while Bess moved around him with the comfortable ease of a woman who had decided to simply stop registering the fact that a duke was in her kitchen. Gabriel looked up when Clara appeared in the doorway. "You're early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I heard you pacing above me around 2. Something shifted in his face. Not embarrassment, but the specific look of a person unaccustomed to being heard. "I think better when I move," he said. "So do I," she said, and sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. Bess set coffee in front of her without being asked. Clara thanked her, which made Bess glance at Gabriel with the brief expressive look of a woman communicating, "I like this one," without a word. "What were you thinking about?" Gabriel asked. "Your roof," she said. He looked at her. "I was running the numbers," she said. "Locally sourced timber, your own labor, you could do the repair for under $40 before summer's end. Wait another year, the floorboards below will have water damage, and you're looking at closer to $150. "You calculated the cost of my roof," he said. "At 2 in the morning. I helped manage the repair fund for my father's church for 3 years, she said. "I know the arithmetic, it comes to me automatically." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You should schedule the work before the end of July. Your men won't lose days to heat sickness, and the dry weather will hold the materials better." Gabriel closed his ledger. He had not, she realized, written in it since she'd sat down. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "can I ask you something else?" "You've been asking me things since I arrived," she said. "I haven't stopped you yet." "Why do you do that?" he said. "Notice things. Fix things. The roof, the numbers. You comforted the kitchen girl yesterday. The young one, Anna. She'd spilled something and was frightened about it. You told her exactly what to say to Mrs. Aldrich and how to say it, and she wasn't frightened anymore. Nobody asked you to do that." Clara looked at him. "Nobody needed to ask me." "But you had no reason." "I had every reason," she said. She was frightened, and I could help. That's sufficient reason." He was looking at her with that quality of attention. She was becoming familiar with the careful, stripped-down one, without the layers of performed warmth he offered everyone else. "Nobody here does that," he said. "Sees what's actually happening and responds to it directly. He paused, without calculating what it will cost them socially. "Most people can't afford to stop calculating," Clara said. "And you can?" "I've already paid the cost," she said. 3 dismissals. Very little social standing. Almost no prospects. She met his eyes. "Once you've lost what people use to threaten you into performing, you're free." A long silence. "That sounds lonely," he said. "Sometimes," she said, "but it's clean." He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, the summer morning was just beginning to light up the kitchen garden, and somewhere in the east pasture, a horse was moving. She could hear the sound of it drifting through the open window, and Gabriel Ashford sat across from her with his cold coffee and his unopened ledger, and looked for just a moment like a man who was not performing anything at all. It was, Clara thought, the best he'd looked since she arrived. She pulled her coffee cup toward her and looked at the table before she could think anything else. She wasn't supposed to think. On the 6th morning, Eleanor summoned her. "You're not doing what I asked," Eleanor said. "I am doing exactly what you asked," Clara said. "I'm being myself." "Being yourself," Eleanor said with a precision that had something sharp tucked underneath it, "appears to be working in the wrong direction." Clara said nothing. "He moved your chair," Eleanor said. "In the morning room. He asked Mrs. Aldrich to move it closer to the east window because he noticed you were squinting at your book in the morning light." Clara hadn't known he'd arranged it. She'd simply noticed one morning that the chair was in a better position and been grateful without thinking too hard about why. "He spent the better part of yesterday afternoon with the estate carpenter," Eleanor continued, "discussing timber and roof repair costs. Apparently someone brought it to his attention." "It needed attention," Clara said. "He instructed Bess to add seed cake to the breakfast table." Eleanor's voice remained level. "Because he noticed you took 2 pieces at tea without saying anything, and he thought you might enjoy having it available in the mornings." Clara was very still. The seed cake. She had not realized he'd seen her with the seed cake. She had thought she was being unobserved. She had not been unobserved. "Your Grace," Clara said carefully, "I have not performed anything. I have not attempted to charm him. I have been exactly—" "I know," Eleanor said. The 2 words landed flat and strange. "That is precisely the problem." Clara looked at her. "What did you think would happen?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Her hands were folded in her lap with absolute precision, and beneath the precision, that old habit thumb, pressing into the back of her hand, slow and rhythmic. "I thought he would see the distance," Eleanor said finally, "between what you are and what his position requires." "And instead he sees what you are," Eleanor said, and something in her voice changed a hairline fracture in the composure there and gone in less than a second. "And he prefers it." Clara held her gaze. "Why does that frighten you?" The word frighten landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor looked at her, and Clara saw it, the thing she'd been catching glimpses of since the first morning. Not cruelty, not calculation. Something older than both, something that had been living behind Eleanor Ashford's composed silver exterior for longer than Clara had been alive. Fear. Raw, old, practiced fear, worn so smooth by decades of containment that it had come to look like contempt. Then it was gone. The composure returned. Perfect. Complete. "The arrangement stands," Eleanor said. "Remember what you're here for." Clara stood and moved to the door. She had her hand on the frame when Eleanor spoke again. "Miss Whitmore." She stopped. A pause. "Close the door on your way out." Clara closed it quietly and stood in the corridor and thought about fear that had been carried so long it had hardened into something that looked like a weapon. She thought about what kind of wound would leave that kind of scar. She thought about it all the way up the stairs. On the 7th evening, the storm came. It arrived the way Hudson Valley storms arrived in July, without warning, without apology. Just a sudden darkening of the sky, and then rain like a decision being made all at once. Clara was in the library when it started. She had developed a habit of the library in the evenings. Gabriel had developed a habit of appearing there roughly 20 minutes after she did. Neither of them had commented on this. He came in with rain on his shoulders, still in his riding coat. "You were outside," she said. "Checking on Oberon," he said. "The gray. He's 12 years old and terrified of lightning. Has been since he was 2. I've tried everything different, stabling different companions, different methods. Nothing fixes it." He said it simply without performance. "So now I just go when the weather's bad. Stay close until it passes." "You could send a hand," Clara said. "I could," he said. "But you go yourself." "I go myself," he said. She looked at him. "Because you understand him better than a hand would." He met her eyes, and for a moment, the storm pressed at the windows, and the lamp between them made the room smaller and more honest than it was in daylight, and neither of them said anything. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "who taught you to hear people the way you do?" "My father," she said. "He says listening is the most important thing a minister can do. He says most people speak to God because they can't find anyone on earth who will genuinely hear them." She paused. "He made certain I could." "You hear more than people intend to say." "Most people say more than they mean to," she said. "You just have to know what to listen for." I was quiet for a moment. Outside the rain was at its heaviest, steady and solid against the glass. "What do you hear?" he said carefully, "when I'm speaking?" She considered the honest answer. She chose to give it. "I hear a man who has spent so long being exactly what every room requires of him, that he's no longer certain what he actually is," she said. "And I hear someone who is very tired of performing and has nearly convinced himself there is no one worth the risk of stopping for." The room held that. Gabriel looked at her with something she had not seen on him before. Not the managed warmth, not the startled amusement, but something underneath both of them. Something without defense. "That's accurate," he said quietly. "I know." "How?" She held his gaze. "Because I recognize it," she said. "I do it too. Or I did until I couldn't afford to anymore." "You don't perform anything," he said. "You're the only person in this house who doesn't." "That's because performing costs more than I have," she said. "So I stopped. And yes, it cost me every position I've ever held, and most of my social prospects, and I regret the practical consequences." She paused. "I don't regret the honesty." He was quiet for a long time. The storm moved through its middle distance. The lamp burned low between them. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He had not used her given name before. She did not think he'd meant to use it now. She watched him notice what he'd done. "Miss Whitmore," he corrected quietly. "It's all right," she said. A longer silence. The rain beginning to ease at the windows, the worst of the storm passing through. "Thank you," he said, for saying the true thing, even when it isn't comfortable." "Someone has to," she said. "Nobody here does," he said. "Nobody has in a very long time." She looked at him and felt the weight of that land in her chest, and felt the corresponding pull, the one she'd been resisting since the first evening, since the first real laugh, since the seed cake she hadn't known he'd noticed. She felt it, and she named it honestly to herself, the way she named everything. She was in danger. Not the polite, manageable kind. The real kind. "Get some sleep," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "You haven't slept properly since I arrived." "The roof keeps me awake," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost a question. "I told you," she said, standing, moving toward the door before she did something irreversible. "Fix it before the month is out." She walked out of the library, and down the corridor, and up the stairs, and into her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she thought about $300, and a leaking church roof, and her father's careful breathing at night. She thought about Gabriel Ashford's face when he stopped performing. She thought about Eleanor's thumb pressing into the back of her hand, and the fear behind the fear, and the thing she'd almost understood in the corridor that morning, and hadn't let herself finish understanding. She sat there for a long time in the dark. "I am in a great deal of trouble," She thought not as a warning, but as a recognition. Clean and honest and too late to matter. She had come here to be a lesson. She was beginning to suspect the lesson was not going to go the way anyone planned. The morning after the storm, Clara came down to breakfast and found the seed cake already on the table. Not on the sideboard with the other pastries. On the table. At her place. Set there deliberately precisely by someone who had thought about it before the kitchen had even opened for the morning. She stood at her chair and looked at it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she sat down, poured her own coffee, and ate 2 pieces without saying a word about it to anyone. Gabriel came in 20 minutes later, exchanged good mornings with the 2 other house guests. A distant cousin of Eleanor's named Mr. Philip Marsh, and his unremarkable wife, and sat at the head of the table and opened the morning paper, and did not once look at the seed cake or at Clara. I didn't need to. The seed cake was already there. Clara drank her coffee and understood with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life watching people say things without words that she was in considerably more trouble than she'd assessed the night before. She excused herself before the table finished breakfast. She needed to think, and she could not think clearly with Gabriel Ashford in the room. She went to the back garden, which was where she'd been going every morning when she needed space without being observed, and she walked the length of it twice with her hands clasped behind her back, working through the problem, the way her father had taught her to work through problems systematically, honestly, without flinching from the uncomfortable parts. The uncomfortable parts were these: she had agreed to a deception. She was being paid to be exactly herself, which meant she was being paid for something she could not help being, which meant the money was genuine, but the purpose was not, which meant every honest thing she said to Gabriel Ashford was simultaneously the truest thing she'd ever done, and part of a lie she had agreed to maintain. She could not separate the honesty from the deception. They had become the same action, and Gabriel was looking at her as though she were the first honest thing he'd encountered in years. That was the part she could not walk away from. She was on her 3rd pass of the garden when she heard the gate behind her and turned to find Gabriel himself in his working clothes with 2 cups of coffee, one extended toward her before he'd even finished closing the gate. She stared at the cup. "You left before the coffee was finished," he said. "I had things to think about," she said. "So did I," he said. "I thought I'd do it out here." She took the cup. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that had developed between them over the past week. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just shared. The kind of silence that required a certain level of trust to maintain without filling it with noise. "Oberon's calmer this morning," he said finally. "The storm passed," Clara said. "He always takes a day or 2 to come back to himself afterward," Gabriel said. "He doesn't forget the fear. He just learns to carry it again." Clara looked at him sideways. "That's a particular kind of knowledge," she said. "Learning to carry fear instead of losing it." "Most things worth knowing are particular," he said. They walked another few paces. Clara was acutely aware of the distance between them, not quite an arm's length close enough that when Gabriel's stride adjusted over an uneven patch of ground, his shoulder almost brushed hers. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes. What were you thinking about before I came out?" She looked at the far hedge. "Honesty," she said. "The cost of it." "You told me last night you'd already paid the cost." "I have," she said. "I'm calculating whether I'm about to pay it again." He was quiet for a moment. "And are you—" She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her, and she looked at him directly, the way she always did, the way that made most people uncomfortable, and said, "I don't know yet." It was, she thought, the truest thing she'd said since she arrived. Possibly the truest thing she'd said in months. Gabriel held her gaze. "I'll tell you something true in return," he said. "All right." "I asked Mrs. Aldrich to move your chair," he said. "In the morning room. You were squinting at your book 3 mornings in a row, and you didn't say anything about it, and I thought—" He paused. "You probably weren't going to say anything about it, so I had the chair moved." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "I noticed," she said. "I know you noticed," he said. "You notice everything. I was curious whether you'd say anything." "Why didn't you simply ask if the light was bothering me?" "Because you would have said it wasn't," he said. to avoid inconveniencing anyone. She opened her mouth. She closed it again. He was right. She absolutely would have said it wasn't bothering her. That, Gabriel said with something in his voice that was quiet and certain, and a little dangerous, is the first time I have ever rendered you speechless, Miss Whitmore. Don't get accustomed to it, she said. He almost smiled. I wouldn't dream of it. They finished their coffee in the garden, and Clara walked back inside with the empty cup in her hand, and the clear, uncomfortable knowledge that the man she had come to make not want her had just demonstrated that he was paying more attention to her than she had been paying to herself. That afternoon, Eleanor introduced Caroline Prescott. She arrived in a carriage that announced itself before it came into view. The sound of well-maintained wheels on a good road. The particular cadence of horses that had never been asked to work hard a day in their lives. Clara was in the morning room with a book she hadn't been reading when she heard it, and she looked up and out the window and watched the carriage stop. Caroline Prescott was 24 years old, from one of the oldest families in the valley, and possessed of the specific polished beauty that came from having never once in her life worried about the next meal or the next month's rent. She entered the house with the ease of a woman who had been entering houses like this her entire life. Not arrogant, Clara noted, just completely at home, in a way that Clara would never be, had never been, and had stopped pretending she might become. Eleanor met her in this hall with a warmth Clara had not seen her direct at anyone else. Caroline, she said. You look wonderful. How is your mother? Very well, thank you. She sends her love. Caroline's voice was low and musical, and perfectly modulated the kind of voice that had been trained from girlhood. She glanced toward the morning room doorway where Clara had appeared. She hadn't meant to appear. She had simply stood up when she heard voices, which was a reflex she regretted immediately. Miss Whitmore, Eleanor said with a smoothness that could have meant anything. Come meet Miss Prescott. She'll be joining us for the next several days. Clara came forward. She shook Caroline's hand. She said the correct polite things. Caroline said the correct polite things in return, and looked at Clara with gray eyes that were intelligent and kind, and absolutely clear about the social arithmetic of the situation without needing to be told any of it. Clara had the sudden, unpleasant sensation of being weighed and understood. I've heard a great deal about you, Caroline said. That's interesting, Clara said. I've heard nothing about you until this moment. A beat. Then Caroline Prescott laughed, genuine surprised, and said, I think I understand now. Understand what? Clara said. What Gabriel meant, she said, and then caught herself, and the pleasantness settled back over her face like a curtain being drawn, and she turned to Eleanor and began asking about the arrangements for dinner. Clara stood in the hall for a moment. Then she went back to the morning room and sat down and picked up her book and read the same sentence 4 times without retaining a single word of it. What Gabriel meant. Gabriel had spoken to Caroline Prescott about her. Recently enough that Caroline had arrived already knowing something, which meant Gabriel had been telling people about the woman his mother had brought to unmake him. She did not know what to do with that. So she sat with it and didn't move and waited for dinner. Dinner was the most dangerous meal Clara had experienced since arriving at Ashford Manor. Not because anyone said anything terrible, because no one did. Because Caroline Prescott was perfectly pleasant and perfectly suitable, and talked to Gabriel with the easy fluency of 2 people who had known each other for years, and Gabriel was perfectly warm in return, and Clara sat 3 seats down the table and watched it, and felt something she had absolutely no right to feel. She felt jealous. Not the hot, obvious kind. The cold, specific kind. The kind that comes from recognizing exactly what you are not, and exactly what someone else is, and understanding the distance between those 2 things with complete clarity. She concentrated on her food. Miss Whitmore, said Mr. Marsh, the cousin from beside her, I understand you've come from near Dalton. Do you know the Harrington family there? I know of them, Clara said. We don't move in the same circles. Ah, said Mr. Marsh with the tone of a man who had just confirmed something he suspected. Of course. From across the table, she heard Caroline say to Gabriel, You were right about the library. The light in the morning must be extraordinary. I'll show you tomorrow if you'd like, Gabriel said. I'd like that very much, Caroline said. Clara set down her fork. She picked it up again. She looked at her plate with great concentration and thought about church roofs and her father's cough, and $300, and all the very good, very practical reasons she was sitting at this table. She did not look at Gabriel, but Gabriel apparently looked at her, because when she finally raised her eyes against her better judgment, against every practical instinct she had, he was watching her from his end of the table with an expression she could not quite read. Not apologetic, not guilty. Something more careful than either of those. Something that looked uncomfortably like he was checking whether she was all right. She gave him nothing. She looked back down at her plate. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of appearing anything other than completely unbothered. She was a woman who had lost 3 jobs for telling the truth. She could survive 1 dinner. She survived it. Barely. 2 days passed. Caroline Prescott was gracious and intelligent and completely appropriate in every way that Clara was not. And Eleanor watched the 3 of them with the careful satisfaction of a woman whose plan was finally executing correctly. Clara watched it too. She watched Gabriel show Caroline the library. She was not in the library, she made certain of that. She watched them ride together in the mornings, Caroline on a neat chestnut mare that matched her perfectly. She watched the county families come to dinner and seat Caroline near Gabriel, and watched them together with the warm approval of people who had already made their calculations and approved of the result. And she watched Gabriel. That was the problem. She could not stop watching Gabriel, and what she saw did not match what she was supposed to be seeing. He was kind to Caroline. He was attentive, correct, generous with his time. He showed her the book she asked about, and laughed at the things she said that were genuinely clever, and listened with real patience when she spoke about her family, or the county, or the social business that occupied the world they both moved through. He was, in short, perfectly adequate with Caroline. And every evening, he came to the library 20 minutes after Clara arrived, and he was something different than adequate. He was real. "You've been avoiding me," he said on the 4th evening since Caroline's arrival, settling into the chair across from her without preamble. "I've been here every evening," Clara said. "You know what I mean," he said. She looked up from her book. He was looking at her directly, the performance stripped back the way it always was in this room at this hour, with this particular lamp burning between them. "I've been giving you space," she said, "to get to know Miss Prescott. Caroline is—" He stopped. "She's a good person. She's been a family friend for years. She's exactly what my mother would choose for me." "I know," Clara said. "You said that very neutrally," he said. "I was aiming for neutral," she said. "You missed," he said, slightly to the left. She put the books down. "Mr. Ashford." "Gabriel," he said. She stopped. "We've been in this room every evening for 10 days, he said. "I'd like you to use my name." "That's not appropriate," she said. "Neither is calculating the cost of my roof at 2 in the morning, he said. "But you did that anyway." She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp burned. "Gabriel," she said, "what do you want from me truthfully?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitation of someone forming a politic answer, the silence of someone who was making sure they got the honest one right. "I want to understand you," he said. "I want to know why you say the things you say, and see the things you see, and why you look at this house, like you're cataloging everything that needs fixing before you have to leave it." The last part landed harder than she expected. "Because I am," she said before she could stop herself. "Are you planning to leave?" "I'm always planning to leave," she said. "People like me don't stay in places like this. We come through, we do what's required, and we go. That's the arrangement." "What arrangement?" he said. The word hit her like cold water. She had said arrangement. She had said the one word she was absolutely not supposed to say. "I mean the practical arrangement," she said, recovering too fast. She could hear herself recovering too fast. "I came for a position. The position will end. I'll go back to looking for the next one." He was watching her, very closely. The way he watched things when he thought they were telling him something they hadn't meant to. "Clara," he said. She didn't correct the name this time. She was too busy managing the fear. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he said. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at this man, at his careful, real, exhausted face, at the way he sat in that chair without pretense, at the 10 evenings of honesty they'd built together in this library, stone by stone, and she felt the shape of the lie between them like a physical thing. A wall she'd agreed to maintain. A wall he was standing on the wrong side of unknowing. "There are things I'm not ready to tell you," she said. It was the most honest answer she could give him, without giving him everything. "That isn't the same as deceiving you." He held her gaze. "All right," he said finally. "All right," she said. "You've never given me reason not to trust you," he said. "I'm going to keep extending that trust until you give me reason to stop." Clara looked at him. She felt the weight of that, the specific crushing weight of being trusted by someone you were deceiving, even with the best of intentions. She felt it settle in her chest like a stone. "Don't do that," she said quietly. "Don't trust people further than they've earned." "You've earned it," he said simply. She picked up her book so she didn't have to answer. The county assembly was announced for the following Saturday, and Eleanor informed Clara at breakfast that she was expected to attend. "All the Valley families will be present," Eleanor said. "It will be a significant social occasion." "I have nothing appropriate to wear to a significant social occasion," Clara said. "I've arranged for something," Eleanor said. Clara looked at her. "You've arranged for me a dress." "For appearances," Eleanor said. "It would reflect poorly on the household." The dress arrived that afternoon, blue wool, well-made, modest, entirely unlike anything Clara had ever owned. She stood in her room and looked at it for a long time, hanging on the wardrobe door, and thought about all the ways she was being arranged and managed and moved into positions she had agreed to occupy, and felt for the first time since arriving genuinely angry. Not at Eleanor. Not exactly. At the situation. At herself for agreeing to it. At the fact that she could not even now see a cleaner way out that didn't involve her father's roof collapsing. Bess knocked and came in to help with the buttons, and stood back afterward and looked at Clara with the frank, warm assessment of a woman who said what she thought. "You look well," Bess said. "I look like someone else," Clara said. "You look like yourself in a better dress," Bess said firmly. "Don't argue with the dress. The dress is on your side." Clara almost laughed. "Is it?" "Everything in this house is on your side," Bess said, "whether it knows it yet or not." And then she left before Clara could ask her what she meant, which was, Clara suspected, entirely deliberate. The assembly hall was full by the time they arrived, all candles and conversation, and the particular social electricity of people who had been looking forward to being seen for weeks. Clara entered behind Eleanor and felt the room adjust to her presence, the way rooms always adjusted to her. A slight recalibration, a reassessment followed by the quiet settling of people into the positions they'd already decided to hold. She was not one of these people. Everyone knew it. She knew it. The dress helped, but the dress did not change what the dress was covering. Gabriel appeared at her left side with a glass of lemonade before she'd been in the room 60 seconds. "You look," he started, and then stopped, and she could see him rejecting the polite options one by one. "Different," she said. "You can say different." "I was going to say like you," he said. "But in a context that hasn't been imposed on you by someone else's idea of what you should look like." She looked at him. "That was a very precise thing to say." "I've been practicing precision," he said. "You've been a good teacher." She accepted the lemonade and turned toward the room so she didn't have to manage what that sentence did to her expression. Caroline was already across the hall, speaking with a group of women who received her with the uncomplicated pleasure of people welcoming someone who belonged. Gabriel watched Clara watch this, and said nothing, which was a form of knowing she was not ready to acknowledge. The trouble came an hour in. It came from a woman named Mrs. Forsyth, who was 60 years old, and had the specific social authority of someone who had never once doubted her right to say what she was thinking. She appeared at Clara's elbow during a gap in the conversation, and looked her over with the sharp, summarizing gaze of a woman who categorized by instinct and reported her findings without apology. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "The minister's daughter from near Dalton." "That's right," Clara said. "I understand you've been staying at Ashford Manor for some time now," Mrs. Forsyth said. Across the hall. Clara could see Eleanor's attention shift toward them, a slight turn of the head, nothing more. What is your position there exactly? I'm a guest, Clara said. A guest. Mrs. Forsythe repeated with a precision that made the word mean several things at once. How interesting. Eleanor doesn't generally... She paused, selecting extend hospitality in that direction. She's been very gracious, Clara said. Indeed. Mrs. Forsythe looked at her with the patient thoroughness of someone who was in no hurry. And what are your plans? After the visit concludes. I'll return to looking for a governess position, Clara said. Same as before. A governess. Another pause. And you came all the way from near Dalton to visit Ashford Manor simply as a guest? Yes, Clara said. Curious, Mrs. Forsythe said with the particular smile of a woman filing information for future use. Very curious. From across the room, Gabriel had begun moving toward them. Clara saw him and very deliberately did not signal anything. No look of relief, no appeal for rescue. She did not need rescuing. She stood where she was and looked at Mrs. Forsythe with calm, direct eyes, and waited. I imagine, Mrs. Forsythe said, that it must be very interesting for someone of your background to see how the other half lives, as it were. I've found it educational, Clara said evenly. And do you find the experience comfortable, being so far outside your usual? She selected the word carefully, element. I find it clarifying, Clara said. It confirms most of what I already suspected. And what did you suspect? That money and comfort are not the same thing, Clara said. And that people with a great deal of the first very often lack surprising amounts of the second. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room that has just heard something they were not certain how to categorize. Mrs. Forsythe looked at her with an expression that moved through outrage reassessment and something that was almost grudging respect in the space of about 4 seconds. You are very direct, she said. I've been told, Clara said. It is not a quality that generally serves women well in society, Mrs. Forsythe said. No, Clara agreed. It serves women well in life. The difference is significant. She was aware without looking that Gabriel had stopped moving toward them, that he had heard the last portion of this exchange, that the expression on his face she couldn't see it, but she could feel it. The way you could feel certain kinds of weather before they arrived was not what Mrs. Forsythe would have expected. Mrs. Forsythe departed soon after, which was either a retreat or a tactical withdrawal, and Clara couldn't tell which. She accepted a refill of her lemonade from a passing server and turned to find Gabriel directly behind her. For how long were you standing there? She said. Long enough, he said. I didn't need help. I know, he said. That's why I stopped coming. She looked at him. He looked back. Something moved between them, not new, not small, and Clara felt it arrive, and felt what it would cost her to acknowledge it, and chose for the moment not to. She wasn't wrong, Clara said. About my element. She was wrong about what element means, Gabriel said quietly. An element isn't where you came from. It's where you function at your best. She stared at him. You, he said, function at your best wherever you are. I have not once seen you diminished by a room, Miss Whitmore. I have seen every room diminished by the absence of you. The assembly hall continued its noise around them. Somewhere across the room, Caroline Prescott was laughing at something a county judge had said. Eleanor was watching Clara from near the refreshment table with an expression that had gone very still. Clara stood in the middle of all of it and looked at Gabriel Ashford and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would not cost her everything. Don't, she said finally, quietly. Please don't say things like that. Why? He said. Because I can't. She stopped. Tried again. Because this isn't what you think it is. This situation. Me being here. It's not what you think. He went very still. What do I think it is? She looked at him. The weight of the arrangement pressed against the inside of her chest like water against a dam. $300. Her father's cough. The canvas patch on the church roof. Eleanor's cold letter, and the rosewater smell, and the money slid across the table. Ruin my son. I think, she said carefully, that you've been lonely for a very long time, And I've been honest with you, and that's been— She chose the word significant to you. And I'm afraid I've let that matter to me more than it should have. Why shouldn't it matter? He said. Because I'm leaving, she said. At the end of 2 weeks I am leaving. And whatever this has been, it has an end date. It has always had an end date. Something in his face changed. Not collapsed. Gabriel Ashford was too controlled for collapse, too accustomed to managing his own reactions in public. But something shifted, moved, rearranged. Is that what you want? He said. To leave. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was trying to memorize, because she knew she was going to lose them. What I want, she said, is not the relevant variable. She set her lemonade glass on the nearest available surface, and excused herself, and walked toward the far end of the room, and she did not let herself look back, and she spent the rest of the evening standing near the window talking to the magistrate's wife about absolutely nothing. And she did it with a steady voice and a composed face, and the specific practiced endurance of a woman who had learned long ago how to hold herself together in rooms that were trying to take her apart. When the carriages were called and the assembly ended, she was the first one out the door. She did not cry until she was back in her room with the door closed. She cried very quietly for a very short time, and then she stopped because she was Clara Whitmore, and she had stopped affording tears at 14, and she had not reacquired the habit since. She lay in the dark and listened to the creak of the 4th floorboard in the east corridor. Gabriel late. His footsteps slower than usual, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about what she had agreed to and what it was costing and whether the arithmetic still made sense. $300. Her father's roof. Gabriel's face in the assembly hall when he'd said, "I have seen every room diminished by the absence of you." She pressed her hands flat against the mattress and breathed. The footsteps in the corridor stopped. Directly outside her door. She held very still. A long pause. Then the footsteps moved on, and she heard the distant sound of Gabriel's door, and the house went quiet. She lay there in the dark for a long time after that. Not sleeping, not crying, just existing in the particular stillness of a woman who has made a decision. She regrets and cannot yet find the courage to unmake. The roof still leaked. Her father still coughed. The money was still the money. But Clara Whitmore, for the first time since she'd arrived at Ashford Manor, was no longer certain that $300 was enough to cover what this was costing her. She did not sleep that night. Not really. She dozed in the hour before dawn and woke with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent the dark hours arguing with themselves and lost. The argument had gone like this. She had agreed to a thing. The thing had terms. The terms were clear. $300, 2 weeks complete disclosure, to no one. She had shaken on it, metaphorically speaking, with the most powerful woman in the county, and she had taken the travel arrangements and the borrowed dress and the seed cake on the breakfast table and all of it. Every small comfort, every arranged convenience had come from Eleanor's pocket and Eleanor's plan, and she had no right to forget that. That was one side. The other side was Gabriel's face outside her door. The pause in the corridor. The footsteps that had stopped and then slowly moved on. She got up before the house was awake and went to the kitchen and found Bess already there, as Bess always was, and sat at the long table without saying anything, and Bess put coffee in front of her and said, "You look like you slept in a thunderstorm." And Clara said, "I feel like it." And that was the entirety of the conversation for a good 10 minutes, which was one of the things Clara had come to value most about Bess. "He asked about you this morning," Bess said finally, without looking up from the dough she was working. Clara's hands tightened around her cup. "Mr. Ashford? Asked if you'd come down yet. Asked if you seemed, and I'm quoting all right." Bess paused her work briefly. "I told him you seemed like yourself, which is as all right as you get." "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me," Bess said. "Thank yourself for being somebody worth asking about." She went back to her dough. "He doesn't ask about the other one, Miss Prescott. Not once in 4 days. He's polite to her, the way he's polite to the furniture, careful and consistent and completely absent." Clara said nothing. "I'm not telling you what to do," Bess said. "I'm telling you what I see. I've been in this house 11 years, and I know the difference between a man being courteous and a man being present. She looked up then, direct and warm, and entirely without sentimentality. With you, he's present. Clara looked at her coffee. It doesn't matter, she said. Why not? Because I'm leaving at the end of 2 weeks, Clara said. That hasn't changed. Bess was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Roofs can be fixed, Miss Whitmore. Other things are harder. Clara looked up at her. Bess had already turned back to the dough. The kitchen filled with the warm, yeasty smell of the morning, and somewhere outside, the birds started up and Clara sat with her coffee going cold in her hands and understood with the clean, specific clarity of someone who could no longer avoid understanding that she was not going to be able to walk away from this house at the end of 2 weeks unchanged. The only question was how much the change was going to cost. Gabriel found her in the library that morning. Not the evening when it was their established and unspoken ritual, but mid-morning when she had retreated there with a book she was genuinely trying to read, and the firm intention of thinking about nothing in particular. He came in without knocking. It was his library. He never knocked and stopped when he saw her, and then came forward anyway, with the directness of a man who had made a decision before he walked through the door. I owe you an apology, he said. Clara looked up. For what? Last night, he said. At the assembly, I said things that I put you in an unfair position. I didn't consider what it would cost you to hear them. He stood on the other side of the table from her, not sitting, not retreating. I'm sorry. She stared at him. In her experience, men of Gabriel Ashford's position did not apologize. They explained, or they redirected, or they simply moved on, as though the thing that had happened had not. They did not stand in their own libraries at 10 in the morning and apologize with their whole undefended faces. You don't owe me an apology, she said. I think I do, he said. You told me clearly that you were leaving. That was honest. I responded by making it harder for you, which wasn't fair. Gabriel. And I'm going to stop, he said, saying things like that. Because you've asked me to, and because you're right that it isn't fair, and because... He stopped. Took a breath. Because I respect you enough to hear what you actually said instead of what I want to hear. The library was very quiet. Clara looked at this man standing there actually listening, actually adjusting, and felt something crack open in her chest in a way she was completely unprepared for. That's, she started, stopped. Most people don't do that. Do what? Hear what's actually said, she said. Most people hear what they were already expecting. You taught me the difference, he said simply. It seemed right to use it. She looked down at her book. She looked at it for a long time without seeing it. Then she said without meaning to, without planning to, before the practical part of her brain could catch the honest part and stop it. I don't want to leave. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Gabriel didn't move. Clara. Don't, she said immediately. Don't I know what I said last night? I know what the situation is. I'm not changing what I said. I just... She pressed her hands flat on the table. I wanted you to know that, because I've been honest about everything else, and it seemed wrong to not be honest about that. I was looking at her with an expression she had no name for. Not triumph, that would have been wrong, and he was too careful for wrong. Not relief exactly, though there was something of that. Something quieter than both. What is the situation? He said, very quietly. Exactly. The word arrangement pressed against her teeth again. She swallowed it. I'm a minister's daughter from near Dalton with no money and 3 professional dismissals and no social standing, she said. That's the situation. That's a list of external facts, he said. That isn't a situation. Gabriel. What are you afraid of? He said. Specifically, not the practical arguments. What are you actually afraid of? She looked a long moment. She thought about giving him the practical arguments anyway, the ones that were real and remained real regardless of feeling. She gave him the truth instead because he had asked for it, and because she owed him at least that much. That this is the best I've ever had, she said. And I agreed to terms that make it temporary, and at the end of it, I go back to what I had before, and what I had before, it was fine. It was my life, and it was fine. But it won't feel fine anymore. She paused. That's what I'm afraid of. That you've ruined small for me. He crossed the room in 4 strides and stopped on her side of the table, not quite touching her close enough that she could see the exact moment his carefully maintained composure became something less managed and more real. Then let me offer you something larger, he said. You can't. I'm not asking you anything, he said. I'm not proposing anything. I'm telling you that what you're afraid of losing, you do not have to lose. That is all I'm saying. She looked up at him. He looked back. The morning light came through the library windows, and the water stain on the ceiling was still there, still unremedied, and the books stood in their patient rows, and it was possibly the most suspended moment of Clara Whitmore's life. And then the library door opened, and Eleanor walked in. She took in the distance between them close, and clearly not arranged casually, in one swift, silent assessment, and her face gave nothing away. But her hands came together in front of her, with a precision that Clara had come to read as the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "Gabriel," Eleanor said, "Caroline is asking for you. She wants to see the east pasture before noon." Gabriel did not move immediately. He held Clara's eyes for one more second, long enough to say something without words, and then he stepped back, and the moment closed, and he turned to his mother with the performance back in place, like a coat put back on. "Tell her I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. "She's waiting now," Eleanor said. 10 minutes, Gabriel said with a quietness that was not negotiable, and left the library. The door closed behind him. Clara and Eleanor stood in the library in silence. "You're not doing what I asked," Eleanor said. "We've had this conversation," Clara said. "We've had a version of it," Eleanor said. "We have not yet had this version." She crossed to the chair nearest the window and sat and looked at Clara with gray eyes that were sharp and careful, and something else that Clara was beginning to identify with more accuracy. "I saw his face just now. We were talking," Clara said. "I know what talking looks like," Eleanor said. "I have been managing this household for 30 years. What I just saw was not talking." Clara said nothing. "Miss Whitmore." Eleanor's voice was low and controlled and carried the specific weight of a woman who was about to say something that cost her something. "I am going to ask you a direct question, and I am asking you to answer it honestly. All right? Do you have feelings for my son?" The room was very quiet. Clara thought about the library in the evenings. She thought about the seed cake on the table. She thought about Gabriel's footsteps stopping outside her door. She thought about, "I have seen every room diminished by the absence of you." "Yes," she said. Eleanor closed her eyes, just for a moment. Then they opened again, and she looked at Clara with something that had gone past strategy into something raw and harder to name. "Then you need to leave," Eleanor said, "earlier than we agreed." "The agreement was 2 weeks." "The agreement was for you to cure him," Eleanor said. "Not to—" She stopped. Something moved across her face. "The agreement is no longer achieving its intended purpose. I think it's best if we end it cleanly, and I pay you the full amount, and you return to Dalton." Clara looked at her steadily. "And if I refuse?" Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "I beg your pardon. If I refuse to leave early," Clara said. "The agreement was 2 weeks. We have 5 days remaining. I intend to honor the terms as stated." "Miss Whitmore." "You hired me to be myself," Clara said. "You got what you paid for. I cannot help what that produced." They looked at each other across the library. 2 women entirely different in every external particular and beneath the external particulars. Clara could see it now more clearly than she'd seen it at the beginning, not so different as Eleanor needed them to be. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor said. And for the first time since Clara had arrived, the voice had something in it that was not control. Not quite. Something underneath the control pressing up. "You know this cannot go where he wants it to go. You know what you are and what this family requires. Why are you?" "Because I promised to be honest," Clara said. "And I intend to be honest until I leave. That includes being honest with myself about what I feel even when it's inconvenient." She paused. "I suspect, Your Grace, that you understand exactly what that costs." Eleanor went very still. "I suspect," Clara said carefully, "that you have been paying that cost for a very long time." The silence that followed was the longest Clara had experienced in this house. Eleanor sat in the chair by the window and did not move, and her hands were folded in her lap with absolute precision, and her thumb pressed slowly into the back of her right hand, and Clara watched it and said nothing more. Finally, Eleanor stood. "The agreement stands," she said. Her voice had returned to its full composure. "Almost. 5 days. And then you will leave, and you will not write, and you will not return. Those are the terms." "Understood," Clara said. Eleanor left. Clara sat down in the nearest chair and put her face in her hands and stayed there for a long time. The formal dinner happened on the 13th day. Eleanor had arranged it with the thoroughness of a woman who believed that situations could be managed if the conditions were correctly set. 12 guests, the most significant county families. Caroline Prescott, seated 2 places from Gabriel at the long table, with the geometric precision of a seating arrangement that communicated intent without saying a word. Clara was placed at the far end near Mr. Marsh, and 2 women she didn't know in a position that was not quite invisible, but was as close as a formal dinner could achieve. She understood the arrangement. She sat in her assigned place and ate her soup and talked to Mr. Marsh about apple orchards, which he knew a great deal about, and she did not look at Gabriel. Gabriel looked at her. She could feel it, the specific quality of his attention, which she had learned over 2 weeks to identify from across a room. She did not return it. She talked about apple orchards. Caroline was at her best. She was warm and clever and completely at ease, and she directed the conversation with the natural authority of a woman who had been trained for exactly this, for holding a table together, for making the people around her feel valued and comfortable, for being precisely what a gathering like this required. She was good at it. Clara, watching from the far end without appearing to watch, admitted this honestly. She was also, Clara noticed, watching Gabriel with an expression that was more resigned than hopeful, as though Caroline Prescott had already quietly understood something that the room had not yet been officially told. The dinner moved through its courses. The candles burned down their first inch. The conversation rose and fell in the rhythms that formal dinners produced, and Clara ate and talked, and remained as much as she was able invisible. She was on her 3rd course when Mrs. Forsyth, who was seated 3 places to Clara's left, and had apparently decided that last week's assembly conversation had been unfinished, said at a lull in the general noise, "Miss Whitmore, I've been meaning to ask. You mentioned at the assembly that you found your visit here clarifying. What exactly has it clarified?" The table settled into the particular listening while pretending not to attention of people who have caught the scent of something. Clara set down her fork. She looked at Mrs. Forsyth with the calm, direct gaze that had cost her 3 jobs. "It's clarified," she said, "that comfort without honesty is just a prettier kind of poverty." Mrs. Forsyth's eyebrows rose. A provocative statement. "It's an honest one," Clara said. "The most comfortable rooms I've ever been in have been full of people saying things they don't mean to people, they don't trust, and calling it society. I don't mean that as an attack. I mean it as an observation." "And our society here," Mrs. Forsyth said with the delicate precision of someone laying a trap, "is it comfortable or honest?" "I've found it more honest than I expected," Clara said. "Thanks to some people in it who surprised me." From the head of the table, Gabriel had stopped his own conversation. Clara did not look at him. She could feel him not looking away. "And what brought you to Ashford Manor, Miss Whitmore?" said one of the women. Clara didn't know Mrs. Carey. She thought the wife of a county commissioner. Her voice was pleasant and curious, and not unkind. "I don't believe I heard the full story." The table went very quiet, in the way that tables went quiet when a question landed that everyone wanted the answer to. Clara felt the moment arrive. She felt it the way you felt a current in a river, that specific shift in the water that told you the depth was changing beneath you. She looked at Mrs. Carey and opened her mouth to give the answer she had given every other time: a family connection, a visit arranged through mutual acquaintance, nothing notable, and stopped. She stopped because Gabriel was looking at her from the head of the table with an expression she had not seen before. Not the careful, managed warmth, not the undefended honesty of their library evenings. Something in between, something public and exposed, and waiting the way a man looks when he has already guessed the answer and needs to hear it confirmed or denied. He knew. Or he was close enough to knowing that the difference had become academic. She had three choices in that moment. She could lie cleanly and maintain the arrangement to its conclusion. She could deflect and buy another day. Or she could say the true thing, the whole true thing, and break every term she'd agreed to and let the consequences arrive. She looked at Gabriel. He looked at her. She said, "I came because I needed the income, and because I was asked, by someone who thought I'd be useful for a particular purpose." The table registered this without quite knowing what to do with it. It was honest, but it was not the whole story, and the shape of the omission was visible if you knew where to look. Gabriel knew where to look. "What purpose?" he said, quietly, from the head of the table, in front of 11 people. Clara looked at him directly. "To demonstrate," she said carefully, "that I was unsuitable." The word landed. The table went completely still. "Unsuitable," Gabriel repeated. "For what?" The air in the room had changed. Eleanor at Gabriel's right hand had gone absolutely motionless in the way of a person who has just watched a plan collapse from the point of no return. "Gabriel," Eleanor said. One word. A warning and a plea simultaneously. He did not look at his mother. He kept his eyes on Clara. "For what?" he said again. Clara looked at him, at this man who had moved her chair closer to the window, who had put seed cake on the breakfast table, who had stopped in the corridor outside her door at midnight, and stood there long enough to make a decision, and then walked on. She looked at him, and thought about $300, and her father's roof, and the terms she'd agreed to. And then she thought about what he'd said in the library that morning. "I respect you enough to hear what you actually said. For you," she said. "I was brought here to demonstrate to you by being exactly who I am, that someone like me was entirely wrong for someone like you. So that you would stop believing that love was a reasonable basis for choosing a wife." The silence that followed was the loudest Clara had ever heard. Mrs. Forsythe made a sound. Mr. Marsh made a sound. Caroline Prescott set down her glass with a very quiet, very controlled click that communicated that she had already known or suspected and was now simply watching the confirmation arrive. Eleanor stood up. "Gabriel," she said. "Sit down, mother," he said, quietly, without anger, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. Eleanor sat down. Gabriel looked at Clara from the length of the table, and Clara looked back at him, and the 11 other people in that room might as well not have existed. "How much?" he said. She flinched. She couldn't help it. "Gabriel, how much did she pay you?" A pause. $300, she said. Howe was quiet for a moment. His face had done something, rearranged itself, she thought, into something more controlled than anything she'd seen from him, which meant something beneath the control was anything but controlled. "And the roof," he said. "Your father's church. That was real." "Yes," she said immediately. "That was real. All of it was—" She stopped. "Everything I said to you was real. I was paid to be myself, Gabriel. I couldn't be anything other than that, even trying. But you knew," he said. "From the first morning. You knew why you were there." "Yes," she said. "And you didn't tell me." "No," she said. The room was completely silent. Clara sat in the silence and did not look away from him because she had spent her whole life paying the cost of honesty, and she was not going to flinch from this one. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's inadequate. I know it's inadequate. I agreed to something that put me in direct conflict with honesty, which is the only thing I've ever been reliably good at, and I chose the money over the honesty, and I cannot undo that. I can only tell you that every single thing I said to you in this house I meant completely." Gabriel was very still. He looked at her for a long, unreadable moment, and then he looked at his mother, and Eleanor met his eyes with the composed, unblinking steadiness of a woman who had been waiting for this confrontation for 40 years and had prepared accordingly. "Did you genuinely believe," he said to her, "that this was the right thing to do?" "I believed it was necessary," Eleanor said. "That isn't what I asked." A pause. "No." Eleanor said quietly. I did not believe it was right. I believed it was necessary, and I told myself those were the same thing. Gabriel stood. He set his napkin on the table with the careful, deliberate movement of a man managing himself with great precision. Excuse me, he said to the table. The whole table guests, and all with the automatic courtesy of someone who could not even in his worst moment forget his manners, and walked out of the dining room. The dinner did not recover. It could not. The guests extracted themselves with varying degrees of grace over the following 20 minutes, and Caroline Prescott was the last to leave, and before she left, she crossed to Clara and looked at her with those clear, intelligent gray eyes. He's been talking about you, Caroline said quietly, since before I arrived. He wrote to me 3 weeks ago, not about the visit, just about a woman who told him his roof was leaking and meant it as a kindness. She paused. I want you to know I came here as Eleanor's guest, not as a candidate. I've known for years I wasn't what he was looking for. She paused again. Now I understand what he was looking for. She left. Clara sat at the empty dinner table in the wreckage of Eleanor's plan and her own choices, and she did not move for a long time. Then she stood, and she went upstairs, and she packed her bag with the efficient, practiced movements of a woman who had left places before and knew how to do it quickly. She was going to go. She was going to go before Gabriel came back and said something she couldn't survive hearing, or before Eleanor came upstairs and said something she couldn't survive refusing to hear, and she was going to take the $300. No, she was going to leave the $300. She did not want the $300, and she was going to find a way back to Dalton and her father and the church with the leaking roof and the life that had been fine before that would be fine again eventually. She told herself this with great conviction. She believed it for approximately 4 minutes, because she had gotten as far as putting on her coat and picking up her bag and opening the door. And there was Gabriel in the corridor standing exactly where he had stood that night 2 weeks ago, when he'd stopped outside her door and not knocked, except this time he was not walking away. You're leaving, he said. Yes, she said. Tonight. Yes. He looked at her. Then he looked at the bag in her hand. Then he looked at her again. Clara, he said. Don't. I think it's better. I don't care what's better, he said. I care what's true. And the true thing is that you just told an entire dining room that my mother hired you to make me not love you, and it didn't work, and you're about to walk out the door before I can... He stopped. Before I can tell you that I know. She stared at him. You know what? That you couldn't help it, he said. Being honest. Being exactly who you are. You agreed to a deception, and then spent 2 weeks being the most honest person in this house because you don't know how to be anything else. And I'm not going to stand in this corridor and tell you that the deception didn't hurt. It did. I won't lie about that. Gabriel. But I've been lied to before, he said. Carefully, consistently by people who knew what they were doing. And what you did, agreeing to something, and then not being able to follow through on the dishonest part of it, because you're constitutionally incapable of sustained dishonesty. Something moved across his face almost. That is the least damaging deception I have ever been involved in. She stopped. That's a very generous way to see it. It's the accurate way, he said. Did you mean to care about me? No, she said. Did you try not to? Yes, she said. I tried. And... She looked at him. She looked at him with the bag in her hand and the coat on her back, and 5 days of her agreement still technically remaining, and she said the thing that had been true for at least 10 days without her being willing to name it directly. And it didn't work, she said. Obviously. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled not into relief, not yet something more precarious than relief. Like a man standing on the edge of something large and knowing it. Put the bag down, he said. Gabriel. Clara. His voice was quiet and certain. Put the bag down, please. She stood in the corridor of Ashford Manor, with her one traveling bag in her hand, and her coat buttoned against a departure she had already half unmade, and she thought about everything she was and everything she was not, and everything she had agreed to, and what it had cost, and what it might still cost. She put the bag down, and somewhere in the east corridor, She heard a sound she had not expected, a door, and then footsteps, and then Eleanor Ashford emerged from the shadows of the hallway, with her silver hair and her composed face, and her hands folded in front of her, and she stopped when she saw the two of them. Nobody moved. And then Eleanor said very quietly, without looking at either of them directly, "I owe you both an apology." Clara stared at her. "I'll be in my sitting room in the morning," Eleanor said, "if you're willing to hear it." And she walked back the way she'd come, and her footsteps faded, and the corridor was quiet. Gabriel looked at Clara. Clara looked at Gabriel. "That," Gabriel said after a moment, "is the first time in my life I have heard my mother use the word apology." "What does it mean?" Clara said. He looked toward the place where Eleanor had disappeared. Then he looked back at Clara, and the expression on his face was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on a human being. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I think we have to be here in the morning to find out." Clara looked at her bag on the floor. She looked at Gabriel. She looked at the house around them, the imperfect, leaking, impractical, impossible house that she had spent 2 weeks cataloging and caring for and learning and not wanting to leave. "All right," she said. She picked up the bag. She took it back into her room. She set it down beside the wardrobe and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. In the corridor, she heard Gabriel's door close, not with relief, not with finality, with the particular quiet of a man who had decided to wait for morning. Clara sat in the dark and thought about apologies and what they cost to give and what they cost to receive, and about Eleanor's thumb pressing into the back of her hand, and about the thing behind the fear that she'd been almost understanding for 2 weeks and hadn't let herself finish. Tomorrow morning she thought she was going to finish understanding it. She wasn't sure yet whether that was going to make things better or considerably irreversibly worse. She sat in the dark and waited for morning. Clara did not sleep again. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, then moved to the chair by the window, then moved back to the bed and finally gave up entirely and sat on the floor with her back against the wardrobe and her knees pulled up and stayed there until the sky outside began to lighten from black to the particular deep blue that came just before dawn. She was thinking about the bag, about how easily she had put it down, about how the decision to stay had taken approximately 4 seconds and had not, if she was being honest, ever been in serious doubt once Gabriel said please. She was thinking about what that meant. That one word from him spoken quietly in a corridor had undone a decision she had made with her whole practical mind and both hands. She was thinking about what it meant to be a woman who prided herself on clear thinking and had just demonstrated that clear thinking had an upper limit, and that upper limit was apparently a tired duke standing in a hallway at 10 at night, saying her name like it was the most important word in the sentence. She was also thinking about Eleanor. "I owe you both an apology." 6 words. From a woman who in 2 weeks, Clara had never once heard concede anything. Not a preference, not a position, not even an incorrect assumption about the weather. 6 words spoken into a corridor and then retreated from before either of them could respond, which was either cowardice or strategy, and Clara had not yet determined which. She thought about Eleanor's thumb pressing into the back of her hand. She thought about what Bess had said 3 days ago when Clara had asked carefully indirectly about Eleanor's history. Bess had gone quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone deciding how much they were permitted to say, and then said, "She came to this family with nothing but ambition and a face that could stop a room. Whatever she had before she left it entirely. I've been in this house 11 years, and I've never once heard her speak of her childhood or her people. Not once." And then Bess had gone back to her work, and Clara had filed it away, and now at 5 in the morning, with her back against the wardrobe, she took it back out and looked at it. A woman who had left everything behind, who had spent 40 years making certain no one knew what she'd left, who had looked at Clara Whitmore, poor, outspoken, educated, beyond her station, constitutionally incapable of pretending to be less than she was, and seen something that frightened her badly enough to pay $300 to make it go away. "What did you see in me?" Clara thought that scared you that much. She sat with that until the sky went from blue to gray, to the first pale edge of morning. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, and went downstairs to wait. Eleanor was already in her sitting room when Clara knocked at 7. She was seated at the small writing desk near the window. not the formal chair she used for managed conversations. Clara noticed, but the working desk surrounded by papers and correspondence, and the ordinary debris of a household being run. It was the most unguarded physical arrangement Clara had seen her in, and she understood that it was deliberate. Eleanor was choosing her territory carefully this morning. "Sit down," Eleanor said. Not a command, not quite an invitation, something in between. Clara sat. Gabriel was not there. Clara had half expected him to be, and his absence said something she hadn't determined the meaning of yet. Eleanor looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that gave nothing away, and then unexpectedly looked down at her hands. Both of them. She looked at them as though she was seeing them from the outside, for the first time the precise way they were folded. The old pressure mark on the back of her right hand, where the thumb had been pressing for decades. "I was born in Albany," Eleanor said. "In 1755. My father was a dock worker. My mother took in mending." She said it with the flatness of someone reading from a document. No inflection, no emotion. Just facts being stated because they had been held back long enough that releasing them required the removal of all unnecessary feeling. "We had very little. I was clever, which was either a gift or a cruelty, depending on the year. I educated myself from whatever books I could find, which was not many. I was determined from the time I was perhaps 14 that I would not live the way my parents lived, that I would find a way into a different world, and I would stay in it." Clara said nothing. She did not move. "I was 19 when I met Thomas Ashford," Eleanor said. "He was 26, recently inherited the estate, completely overwhelmed by what he'd come into and looking for someone practical enough to help him manage it. I was practical. I was told, striking. The combination was sufficient." A pause. "I accepted his proposal in 3 weeks. I have never once regretted the practical wisdom of that decision." "But," Clara said. Eleanor's hands tightened slightly. Released. "There was a man," she said. "Before Thomas. A schoolteacher in Albany. His name was David Marsh. He had no money, no prospects, no family name worth mentioning. He had read every book in the city library and could argue philosophy for 4 hours without repeating himself, and he loved me." She stopped. "He loved me with the specific, inconvenient completeness of a man who sees exactly who you are and wants that particular person and no improved version of her." The room was very quiet. "I left him," Eleanor said. "I chose Thomas and the estate, and the name, and the life I had decided to build. I told myself it was the sensible choice. That love without security was a luxury for people who could afford the consequences of failure, and I could not." She looked up then for the first time and met Clara's eyes. "I told myself that for 40 years. Clara held her gaze. "Did you believe it?" "Some years more than others," Eleanor said. "The years when Gabriel was small and the house was full and Thomas was alive and everything I had built was around me and functioning, those years I believed it completely." She paused. "The years since Thomas died, when the house is quiet and Gabriel performs his role with such exhausting, heartbreaking precision, those years I believe it less." She stood, then moved to the window, stood with her back to Clara for a moment. "When Gabriel began refusing the matches I arranged, I told myself it was stubbornness, romanticism, the naive conviction of a man who had never had to choose between love and survival." Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "It took me longer than it should have to understand that he was making the choice I should have made, and that watching him make it terrified me. Because if he was right to make it, then I was wrong to refuse it. And if I was wrong, then 40 years of that choice is very hard to look at," Clara said quietly. Eleanor turned. She looked at Clara with an expression that was the most unprotected thing Clara had seen from her. "You are very direct," she said. "You asked for honesty," Clara said. "Last night. That was what the apology meant." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I suppose it was." A pause. Clara took a breath. "Why me?" she said. "Of all the women you could have chosen, why me specifically?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Because you reminded me of myself, the self I left in Albany." The words landed in the room, and neither of them moved. "You were everything I was and refused to remain," Eleanor said. Poor, educated, above your station, honest, past the point of social wisdom, refusing to perform smallness you didn't feel. I looked at you, and I saw the woman I buried 40 years ago, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought if I could make Gabriel see you as unsuitable, I could prove finally that I had been right, that I had made the correct choice, that the woman I was at 19 was correctly discarded." Clara stood up. She stood because she needed to be standing for what she was about to say. "You brought me here," she said, "to prove that you were right to abandon yourself." Eleanor did not answer. She didn't need to. "And instead," Clara said, "you watched your son fall in love with the woman you used to be." A sound came from Eleanor. Then not quite a word. Not quite nothing. Something between them from a place that was clearly not used to releasing anything. She pressed her hand flat against the window frame and stood very still, and Clara watched her hold herself together with the practiced precision of a woman who had been holding herself together for 40 years and felt something break open in her own chest that was not quite grief and not quite compassion, but was made of both. "Your Grace," Clara said. "Eleanor." Eleanor turned at the given name. "The man in Albany," Clara said. "David Marsh. What happened to him?" A long pause. "He married a schoolteacher's daughter in 1782, Eleanor said. They had 4 children. He died in 1809. I received word through a correspondence I maintained that he never knew about." She said it with the specific flatness of someone reporting facts that are too large to carry with full feeling. "He was happy, I believe. She was good to him." "Then he was all right," Clara said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He was all right." "And you?" Eleanor looked at her. "I built something that will outlast me by generations," she said. "I made a family out of nothing. I raised a son who is a better person than I am, which is all any parent should want, and more than most achieve." She paused. "Whether that constitutes all right is a question I've been answering differently depending on the year." Clara looked at her for a long moment. This woman composed powerful, afraid, alone in the specific way that came from having chosen the world over the self for so long that the self had become a stranger. Clara thought about what it cost to look in the mirror of another person's life and see the version of yourself you had left behind. "He loves me," Clara said. "Your son. I need you to know that I know that, and I know what it means, and I'm not. I came here without anything to offer him. That's still true. I don't have money or breeding or the first idea how to be a duchess." "No," Eleanor said. "But I know how to hear him," Clara said. "I know how to see what's actually there instead of what a room requires. And I know," she paused, "I know how to tell him when the roof is leaking before it becomes a beam." Something happened in Eleanor's face. Something that on a woman less controlled would have been the beginning of tears. On Eleanor Ashford, it was a single fractional softening around the eyes there and gone in the space of a breath. That is," Eleanor said carefully, "a more significant qualification than it sounds." "I know," Clara said. They stood in the morning light, the two of them, and did not say anything else for a moment. The house was beginning to come alive around them. Footsteps below, the smell of coffee, the distant sound of the stables being opened for the morning. "There is one more thing," Eleanor said. She crossed to the writing desk and picked up an envelope already sealed and held it out to Clara. "A letter for Gabriel. I wrote it this morning. It says—" She paused. "It says what I've just said to you, among other things." Clara looked at the envelope. "You should give it to him yourself." "I know," Eleanor said. "I will. But I wanted—" She stopped. "I wanted you to know first. That I intend to. That I'm not going to retreat from it this morning." She paused. "I have a habit of retreating from things that cost me. I'm attempting to stop." Clara took the envelope. She looked at it, then back at Eleanor. "I didn't take the money," she said. "I left it in your sitting room on the desk the night of the dinner. I don't want it." Eleanor looked at her. "Why not?" "Because the roof can wait," Clara said. "And I'd rather not have taken it at all than spend it." A very long pause. "Miss Whitmore," Eleanor said. "Clara," she said. Another pause, shorter. "Clara," Eleanor said with the careful deliberateness of a woman trying on a new habit. The money was already sent to your father's church this morning, an anonymous donation, the full amount and enough additional for the interior repairs. She met Clara's eyes. It was the least dishonest thing I could do with it. Clara stared at her. The least? Eleanor repeated. Gabriel was in the east pasture with Oberon when Clara found him. He heard her coming and turned before she reached him and looked at her with the expression of a man who had not slept and was not pretending otherwise. Oberon stood at his shoulder, occasionally pressing his large gray head against Gabriel's arm, in the patient, insistent way of horses who had decided someone needed steadying. "My mother," Gabriel said. "We talked," Clara said. He waited. "She told me things," Clara said. "That she should probably tell you herself, and she intends to. But She stopped. "I need to tell you something first, before she does. Because it will change how you hear some of what she says, and I want you to hear it clearly." He turned fully toward her. Oberon shifted, watching Clara, with the large, calm eyes of an animal who had made up his mind about her weeks ago. "What she did," Clara said, "was wrong. Hiring me, arranging the deception, trying to manage your life through manipulation instead of honesty. That was wrong, and she knows it, and she'll tell you so herself." She paused. "And it came from a place that I think when you hear it, you'll understand. Not excuse. Understand." "What place?" he said. "Fear," Clara said. "The very old kind. The kind that gets into the bones." He was quiet for a moment. "Fear of what?" "Of you being right," Clara said. "About love." He looked at her. She looked back at him, standing in the morning light of the east pasture, with the grass still wet from 2 nights past, and Oberon breathing steadily between them. "She made the opposite choice once," Clara said. "A long time ago. And she has been justifying it ever since by making certain the world confirmed it was the right one." She paused. "You were about to disprove 40 years of justification. That was what she couldn't allow." Gabriel was very still. "I'm not telling you to forgive her immediately," Clara said. "I'm telling you so that when she comes to you this morning, you don't hear her as a villain. She isn't one. She's a woman who is 61 years old and has just admitted to herself for the first time that she was afraid." A pause. "That's not nothing." Gabriel looked away, out over the pasture, past the fence line toward the river that ran along the eastern edge of the property. Clara had never seen him look uncertain before. Not quite. He always managed his uncertainty the way he managed everything, efficiently internally, never fully visible. Now it was visible. "Did she hurt you?" he said. "The situation hurt me," Clara said. "She created the situation. There's a difference." "Clara." "Gabriel." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, straight without apology, like it was simply true. "I am not a fragile thing. I've been managed and dismissed and underestimated by better than her." She paused. "And I am standing here this morning because I chose to stay, which means I've already answered the question about whether the hurt was survivable." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted from the uncertain man looking at the horizon, back to the man she knew, the one behind the performance, the one who was real. "What are we doing?" he said. "I don't know exactly," she said. "I know that I stayed when I should have left, which means I've already made the important decision. I know your mother is about to have the hardest conversation of her life with her son, and I think you should let her have it fully, and I think after that we should," she paused, "talk about what actually happens next." "What does happen next?" he said. "That depends," she said, "on several things. On what your mother says and what you decide after you hear it. And on—" She stopped. "On what?" he said. She looked at him. "On whether you still want the same things you wanted yesterday, before you knew everything." He held her gaze. "I knew most of it yesterday," he said. "I'd guessed the arrangement a week ago, Clara. Maybe longer." She stared at him. "You what?" "The way you'd catch yourself," he said. "Mid-sentence sometimes. The way you answered certain questions true, but not complete. The way you looked at my mother sometimes like you were calculating something." He paused. "I'm not stupid, and I've been watched and managed my whole life. I know what it looks like." "Then why didn't you say anything?" she said. "Because everything else was real," he said. "And I decided the everything else was what mattered." He looked at her steadily. Was I wrong? No, she said immediately without space for deliberation. No, you weren't wrong. Then we're all right, he said. Gabriel, we are categorically not all right, she said. We are in the middle of an enormous— I didn't say we were finished, he said. I said we were all right. He held her gaze. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. Oberon pushed his nose against Gabriel's shoulder again. Gabriel didn't move his eyes from Clara. Your mother is waiting, Clara said finally. I know, he said. Give me a minute. Take your time, she said, and turned to go. Clara. She stopped. The roof, he said. I've scheduled the repair, next Monday. Locally sourced timber estate labor. Should come in at around $38. She turned back. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to think of as his real one, the one with no layers over it. Under 40, she said. You said under 40, he said. I see no reason to argue with the arithmetic. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, Go talk to your mother, Gabriel, and walked back toward the house. She was almost to the gate when she heard him say, not loudly, not performed, just spoken to the morning air in Oberon's patient gray ear, $38 and not a cent more. She did not smile until she was through the gate. Then she smiled for a long time by herself, walking back to the house. She did not hear what passed between Gabriel and Eleanor. She had no right to, and she did not try to. She went to the kitchen and sat with Bess and drank coffee, and did not explain what was happening, because Bess had clearly already assembled a working theory from the information available in the house, and the working theory appeared to be approximately correct. He talked to her, Bess said. He's talking to her now, Clara said. Bess nodded. Good, she said, and put more coffee in Clara's cup, and that was the end of that conversation. It was 2 hours before Gabriel appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked different, not broken, not resolved. Something in between the way people looked after a hard conversation that had gone better than they feared, and worse than they'd hoped, and was overall necessary in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. He looked at Clara. She wants to speak with you, he said. Is she? Clara started. She's all right, he said. She's more all right than she's been in a long time, I think. Which is a strange thing to say given the morning we've had. He paused. She asked me to tell you she's in the library. The library, Clara said. She said. Gabriel stopped. Something crossed his face that might in a different context have been the beginning of a laugh. She said she thought you might appreciate the location. Clara stood up. She looked at Gabriel at his tired, real, unperformed face, and she put her hand on his arm for just a moment as she passed him. He covered her hand with his briefly, and then she was past him and into the corridor and making her way to the library. Eleanor was standing near the east wall, looking up at the water stain on the ceiling. He's having it fixed, Clara said from the doorway. I know, Eleanor said. He told me. She did not look away from the ceiling. I've been looking at that stain for 3 years, she said. I told myself it wasn't urgent. It wasn't urgent yet, Clara said. That's different. Is it? Eleanor said. Finally she looked down and at Clara. I told him, she said. Everything. About Albany. About David. About what I was afraid of. She paused. He listened. He did not make it easy, which was correct of him. And he did not make it impossible, which was generous of him. She paused again. He is a better person than I am. He learned from someone, Clara said. Eleanor looked at her. The parts of himself, he's ashamed of the performance, the management, the keeping everyone at arm's length, those he built himself, Clara said. The parts that are good, the way he remembers every name, the way he notices what people need before they say it, the way he goes to the stable in a thunderstorm for a horse that's frightened those came from somewhere. She paused. I don't think he built those alone. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. You are very determined, she said, to find the best possible interpretation of everyone around you. No, Clara said. I'm determined to find the accurate one. Sometimes those are the same thing. Eleanor looked at her. Then she did something Clara had not seen her do in 2 weeks. She crossed to Clara directly, not to a chair, not to a window, not to any managed position, and stopped in front of her and held out her hand. Not for shaking. Just extended. Open. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. Eleanor's hand was dry and cool and much smaller than it looked, and she held Clara's hand with a grip that was firm and brief, and said without words something that Eleanor Ashford probably did not have the practice to say with them. Not yet. Maybe soon. "I will require time," Eleanor said, "to become less of what I've been." "Take it," Clara said. "Time is the one thing that doesn't have to be rushed." Eleanor let go of her hand. "Gabriel would like to speak with you," she said. "He's in the East Garden. He said you'd know where." Clara knew where. She went. Howe was standing at the far end of the garden path, where the apple trees started the same place he'd found her that morning almost 2 weeks ago, when he'd brought 2 cups of coffee, and they'd walked in the shared silence that had become their specific language. He did not have coffee this time. He had nothing in his hands, which was unusual for him, and he stood with his hands open at his sides in the posture of a man who has decided to stop holding things. "How was she?" Clara said. "Honest," he said. For the first time genuinely honest, about all of it. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know. About Albany. About any of it." "I know," Clara said. "She was—" He stopped. "She was so afraid, all this time, of me making the choice she didn't. Because if I made it and it worked, then everything she built on the opposite choice was—" He stopped again. "I know," Clara said. "She's been protecting herself," he said. "All these years I thought she was protecting me, and she was partly, but underneath it." "People rarely do things for only one reason," Clara said. He looked at her. "You knew." "I guessed," she said. "I didn't know." "The thumb," he said. She blinked. "You noticed the thumb. I've lived with her for 30 years, he said. "I noticed it when I was 8. I never knew what it meant until today." He exhaled a long, slow breath of a man putting something down that he's been carrying without knowing it. "She told me she was sending your father's roof the money." "She told me as well," Clara said. Is that sufficient?" he said. "I know it isn't the same as the deception not happening. But is it?" "It's sufficient," Clara said. "The roof was the reason I came. The roof is being repaired. The reason is resolved." "And everything that came after the reason," he said. She looked at him. "That's a different question." "Yes," he said. "It is." He held her eyes. "Clara, I have something to say, and I want to say it clearly, without the performance, without the managed version. Can I do that?" "You've been doing that for 2 weeks," she said. "Don't stop now." He almost smiled. Then it settled, and what remained was the real thing, the undefended thing, the thing she had come to believe was the most valuable thing about Gabriel Ashford. "I love you," he said. "That's the clear version. I love who you are, and the way you see things, and the way you refuse to pretend the roof isn't leaking, even when everyone else has decided to live with the leak. I love that you made me fix something that has needed fixing for 3 years. I love that you spoke honestly to a table full of people who could have made your life very difficult. And you did it because the honest thing needed to be said more than the comfortable thing." He paused. "I love that you put the bag down." Clara stood in the apple orchard at the end of the garden path and looked at Gabriel Ashford and did not say anything for a moment, because she was a woman who believed in precision, and she wanted to get the next sentence exactly right. "I have no money," she said. "I have no social standing. I have 3 professional dismissals on my record. I will correct people when they are wrong, including you, and especially about things like roofs and Latin grammar and the origins of mathematical formulas. I will tell the truth in rooms where it costs me to tell it, and I will not always handle that cost gracefully." She paused. "I have no idea how to be a duchess." "I'm not asking you to be a duchess," he said. "Gabriel, I'm asking you to be Clara Whitmore," he said. "In this house. Permanently. That's the entirety of the request." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about small, which was what she'd had before, And fine, which was what she'd told herself it was, and the specific, irreversible way this man had ruined both words by being exactly what he was in a library at night with the lamp burning between them. "You're certain," she said. "I have never," he said, "been more certain of anything." She held his gaze. She thought about her father at his desk in the morning light. She thought about the church roof now being repaired. She thought about Eleanor's hand in hers, cool and small and honest for the first time in 40 years. She thought about Bess, and the seed cake, and the fourth creaking floorboard, and Oberon pressing his gray head against a tired man's shoulder in a thunderstorm. "The Latin inscription above the library door," she said. "It has a grammatical error." "I know," he said. "I'd like to have it corrected," she said. Something broke open in his face, slow, unstoppable, completely real. "I'll have the stonemason in next week," he said. "After the roof," she said. "After the roof," he agreed. She stepped forward. He met her halfway, which was, she thought, exactly right. Neither of them moving all the way, both of them covering equal ground. When she reached him, she put both hands flat against his chest, and he put both hands over hers, and they stood in the apple orchard in the July morning, with the house behind them, and the river somewhere in the distance, and the particular suspended quiet of two people who have just decided something irrevocable. "Yes," Clara said, to the clear question. He closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, he looked like a man who had stopped performing completely, and found to his considerable relief that he still existed without it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," she said. "Fix the roof." "The stonemason is already scheduled," he said. "That's the carpenter," she said. "Pay attention." And he laughed, the real one, the startled one, the one that had undone her in a dining room 2 weeks ago, and she stood in it and let it do what it did, which was make everything feel like it had been worth it. Every dismissal, every difficult room, every true thing said at a cost too high to easily afford. All of it had brought her here. She thought she could live with that arithmetic. The news traveled faster than any carriage. By the following morning, before Gabriel had spoken to a single county official, or sent a single formal letter, the Hudson Valley knew. The way it always knew things in communities where everyone's business was everyone else's quiet occupation, not through announcement, but through the specific, unstoppable current of people who had been at the dinner, or had spoken to someone who had been at the dinner, or had received a call from Mrs. Forsythe, who had apparently decided that what she had witnessed was too significant to keep to herself for any longer than the ride home. Clara learned the extent of it from Bess, who reported the morning's kitchen intelligence with the calm thoroughness of a woman who considered information management part of her professional responsibilities. Mrs. Hale came by at 8. Bess said, not looking up from the bread she was shaping. Said she was calling on Eleanor. Eleanor saw her for 4 minutes and sent her home. 4 minutes, Clara said. Eleanor timed it, Bess said. I heard the clock. What did Mrs. Hale want? To know if it was true, Bess said. Eleanor told her the family's arrangements were the family's business, and that if Mrs. Hale had come to offer congratulations, she was welcome to leave them at the door, and if she had come for anything else, she was welcome to leave entirely. Bess paused. Mrs. Hale left entirely. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. And the rest of the county, divided. Bess said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who found social conflict professionally interesting. Half think it's a scandal, the other half think it's a scandal worth admiring. Mrs. Forsythe apparently is in the second half. Mrs. Forsythe, Clara said with some disbelief. She told 3 separate households that any woman who could silence a dinner table with a sentence and then refuse to apologize for it was exactly the kind of woman the Ashford family needed, Bess said. I'm told she said this with considerable enthusiasm. Clara stared at the table. I do not understand that woman. She respects a spine, Bess said. She's been surrounded by people without them for 40 years. You're a novelty. She looked up then briefly. Don't be too flattered. She'll find something to criticize once the novelty wears off. I can live with that, Clara said. Bess looked at her for a moment. That direct, warm, entirely unsentimental look that Clara had come to understand was Bess's version of deep affection. Yes, Bess said. I believe you can. and she went back to her bread, and the kitchen filled with the warm, yeasty smell of morning, and Clara sat in it and thought about what it felt like to be somewhere she was permitted to stay. It felt, she thought, like the difference between holding her breath and breathing. She had not fully understood until this moment how long she had been holding it. Gabriel found her an hour later in the library, which was where he always found her, because she was always there when she needed to think, and she needed to think this morning. He came in without knocking, as he always did, and sat in the chair across from her without asking, and looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his real one. "Mrs. Hale came," he said. "I heard," Clara said. "Bess has excellent intelligence networks. 3 other families sent notes this morning," he said. "Formal notes, the kind that ask questions without appearing to ask questions." "And," Clara said. "And I answered them with formal notes of my own," he said. "The kind that answer questions without appearing to answer them." He paused. "Which is to say, I confirmed nothing and declined nothing and left everyone in exactly the state of uncertainty that will require them to wait for an official announcement." "Is there going to be an official announcement?" Clara said. He looked at her. "That depends on you." She looked back at him. "You proposed in an apple orchard," she said. "Yesterday morning, I said yes." "You said yes to Clara Whitmore living in this house permanently," he said. "That was the specific question. I want to make certain you understand what comes after that. Not the social management, you know how to handle rooms, you've demonstrated that comprehensively. The practical realities." He paused. "You'll be expected at county functions, at church, at the kind of dinners where Mrs. Hale asks questions and Mrs. Forsythe delivers verdicts. You'll be introduced as my wife, which means everything you are will be public, and people will find it remarkable, and some of them will be remarkable about it in ways that aren't kind." "Gabriel," Clara said. "I want you to have the full picture," he said. "I have been poor and outspoken and repeatedly dismissed my whole life," she said. "People finding me remarkable in unkind ways is not a new condition. I've been managing that since I was old enough to have an opinion." She held his gaze. "The difference is that now I'll be managing it with a roof over my head and seed cake at breakfast." Something broke open in his face. "That," he said, "is either the most practical or the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "Both," Clara said. "I am both of those things." "Yes," he said. "You are." He stood up, crossed to her side of the table, and held out his hand open like his mother had done, but with a different quality of waiting. "Come with me. There's something I want to show you." She took his hand. I took her to the library's east wall. The water stain was still there. It would be there until the roof was repaired and the ceiling replastered, which was now a documented plan with a scheduled date and a materials list Clara had personally reviewed. But he was not looking at the water stain. He was looking at the window beside it, where the morning light came through at the angle Clara had been squinting against the first week until her chair was moved. "Look at the inscription," he said. She turned. Above the library's interior archway, the one that separated the reading alcove from the main shelving, the family motto was carved in stone. She had noticed the error the first day. She had not until this moment noticed that below the original carving, someone had already begun the careful work of correction. The stonemason's marks were fresh and clean, the stone pale where the old letters had been gently dressed back. "You started it already," she said. "Yesterday afternoon," he said. "After the apple orchard." He paused. "I thought it was time." She looked at the fresh stone. The error had been a single transposed word, the Latin for strength placed where truth belonged, so that the motto had read for as long as anyone could remember. "By strength we endure," instead of what it was supposed to read. She had looked up the original family records in the second week and found the correct version in a document 40 years old. Nobody had checked. Nobody had looked. "By truth we endure," she said. "That's what it should always have said," Gabriel said. "According to the original grant document, somewhere in the last century, someone made an error, and everyone after them simply accepted it as correct, because it had been there long enough to look permanent." Clara looked at the fresh marks in the stone. "Things aren't wrong less often just because they've been wrong for a long time," she said. "No," he said. "They're not. He looked at her. You said that your second day here, in the library, you were looking at the inscription, and I asked what you were thinking and you said that. She stared at him. I didn't know you heard me. You said it quietly, he said. I was pretending to read. He paused. I was pretending to read quite a lot in those first days. It gave me an excuse to be in the same room without having to explain why. Clara looked at him for a moment. You were nervous, she said. Thoroughly, he said. You didn't seem nervous. I've had 30 years of practice at not seeming things, he said. But yes, thoroughly nervous. He held her gaze. You were the first person I'd met in years who I was afraid of losing before I'd properly found them. She held that, turned it over, let it mean what it meant. I was supposed to make you not want me, she said. I know, he said. It was a significant failure of the plan. From your mother's perspective. From everyone's perspective except mine, he said. From mine, it was the most successful 2 weeks of my adult life. Clara looked at the fresh marks in the stone one more time. She thought about errors that became permanent through inattention. She thought about things that stayed wrong until someone finally looked. After the roof, she said. The inscription gets finished. The stonemason is already scheduled for both, he said. I made one appointment. She turned to look at him. Efficient. I had a good teacher, he said. The conversation with her father happened 3 days later. Gabriel insisted on coming. Clara had not asked him to, had in fact suggested quietly that she should go alone first, that her father deserved to hear this from her directly before meeting the man involved. Gabriel had listened to this with the patient attention. He gave all her arguments, and then said that he understood the reasoning and respected it entirely, and was coming anyway because it was the right thing to do, and he had spent enough of his life doing the comfortable thing instead of the right one. She had not argued further. He was correct, and they both knew it. The road to her father's parish took most of a morning. They traveled in Gabriel's carriage, which was considerably more comfortable than the hired wagon that had brought Clara to Ashford Manor 6 weeks ago, and they spent most of the journey in the companionable quiet that had become their natural state, not silence born of nothing to say, but silence born of enough comfort that saying things was a choice rather than a necessity. At one point, somewhere in the middle. Stretch of the road, Clara said. He's going to ask you difficult questions. Good, Gabriel said. He won't be impressed by the title, she said. Better, Gabriel said. He'll want to know what kind of man you are, she said. Not what kind of estate you have, or what the county thinks of you. He'll want to know specifically how you treat people who can do nothing for you. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. What will you tell him? I'll tell him, Clara said, about a man who goes to the stable in a thunderstorm for a horse that's frightened because he understands him better than anyone else does, and who noticed a woman squinting at her book in the morning light and moved her chair before she could say it wasn't bothering her. She paused. And who scheduled a roof repair based on arithmetic he didn't have to take on faith but did. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. That's a very specific testimony. My father values specificity, Clara said. He says the devil is in the generalities, that anyone can claim to be kind in the abstract. The truth is in the particular. He sounds, Gabriel said, like someone I'm going to find it very difficult to argue with. You're not going to argue with him, Clara said. You're going to agree with him on most things and be honest about the rest. And if he doesn't approve, she looked at him. He'll approve, she said. But I need you to earn it. Don't use the title. Don't manage the room. Just be who you are in the library. With no performance, he said. None, she said. That Gabriel said, I can do. Her father was in the churchyard when they arrived. Not because he knew they were coming, she had sent a letter but wasn't certain it had arrived before them, but because he was always in the churchyard on Thursday mornings, which was when he did the quiet maintenance that the parish couldn't afford to pay anyone else for. He was patching a section of the fence when the carriage came up the road, and he straightened and looked, and Clara saw the exact moment he recognized her through the carriage window, because his whole face changed the way fathers' faces changed at the sight of their children. Immediate, involuntary, completely unmanaged. She was out of the carriage before it had properly stopped. Her father caught her with both arms the way he always had, with the complete, unself-conscious warmth of a man who had never once in his life worried about whether displays of affection were appropriate. He held her for a long moment, without saying anything, which was what he did when something mattered too much for immediate words. Then he looked over her shoulder at Gabriel, who had descended from the carriage and was standing at a respectful distance, with his hat in his hands and his whole unperformed self exactly on his face. Her father looked at him for a long moment. "You're the Duke," he said. "Yes, sir," Gabriel said. "Though Clara's asked me not to lead with that." Her father looked at Clara. Clara raised her eyebrows slightly, which was a communication system they had developed when she was about 9 years old and had never needed to update. "He's honest about being told things," her father said to Clara about Gabriel while Gabriel listened. "That's a reasonable beginning." "He's honest about most things," Clara said. "When he remembers, he's allowed to be." "I'm working on the remembering," Gabriel said. Her father looked at him again. The long, patient, entirely unintimidatable look of a man who had spent 40 years reading people in confessional and public, and every state in between. Gabriel held it without flinching, without performing with exactly the steadiness that Clara had told him was what the moment required. "Come inside," her father said. "I'll make coffee. The roof's been fixed, so I'm not embarrassed about the building anymore." "I heard about the donation," Gabriel said carefully. "Anonymous," her father said with the particular tone of a man who had determined the source of an anonymous donation and was choosing not to press the point. "Very generous, whoever it was." "Indeed," Gabriel said. "Whoever it was." They went inside. Her father asked difficult questions. He asked them in the patient, specific way he asked all difficult questions, without accusation, without pressure, with the genuine and slightly implacable interest of a man who wanted real answers and was willing to wait as long as necessary for them. He asked Gabriel what he was afraid of. Gabriel said public loneliness, the specific kind that came from being surrounded by people who needed you to remain exactly what you were, so their world made sense. Her father nodded and wrote nothing down, and asked what he intended to do about it. Gabriel said he'd made a start. Her father asked what the start looked like. Gabriel said it looked like Clara. Her father looked at Clara. Clara looked at the table. He asked what Gabriel understood about the kind of woman Clara was, not what he found appealing about her, but what he understood about what it would actually cost both of them for her to be that woman in the context he was proposing. Gabriel said he understood it would cost them socially, that not every family in the valley would adjust to it gracefully, that there would be rooms that didn't know what to do with her, and people who would try to manage her into a shape that was more comfortable for them. He said he intended, when those situations arose, to make it very clear that the shape she already was the correct one and did not require adjustment. Her father was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said, "That's the right answer. It's also the easy answer to give sitting here. The question is whether you give the same answer in a room full of people who are making it inconvenient." "I gave it in a dining room full of county families last week," Gabriel said. "It was inconvenient." Her father looked at Clara again. Clara said, "He told a table of 12 people that the most important person in the room was the one he was looking for." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you fix the roof?" $38, Gabriel said. "Locally sourced timber." Her father looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a word, but was unmistakably a man conceding something he had not expected to concede. "Stay for dinner," he said. "We'll talk more." They stayed for dinner. They talked more. By the time the sun went down, her father had argued with Gabriel about 3 separate theological points, won and lost 2, and appeared to find this arrangement entirely satisfactory. He walked them to the carriage when they left, and he held Clara's hand for a moment before she got in. "He's real," he said quietly, just to her. "I know," she said. "You found a real one," he said. "That's harder than people think." "He found me," she said. "Technically." "No," her father said with the mild, absolute certainty of a man who had thought this through. "You found each other. Don't let him take credit for the whole of it." She kissed his cheek. He patted her hand. She got into the carriage. They drove back to Ashford Manor in the dark, and Clara sat beside Gabriel rather than across from him, which was a small thing, and not a small thing, and somewhere in the middle of the road. He took her hand and held it without saying anything, and she let him. And the dark moved past the windows, and the Hudson Valley settled into its summer night around them. They were married in September. Not a large ceremony. Clara had made this clear early, and Gabriel had agreed without argument, which was one of the things she was discovering she appreciated most about him: his ability to distinguish between what he wanted and what a room expected, and to choose the former when the distinction mattered. The church was her father's. It had a new roof. The light through the repaired windows fell on the small gathering of people who had come, not because they were expected to, but because they wanted to, which made it the most honest room Clara had ever stood in. Eleanor sat in the front row. She had asked the week before if she was welcome. She had asked Clara, not Gabriel, quietly in the library without performance or self-justification. Just the question plainly stated and the evident willingness to accept whatever answer came. Clara had said yes. Eleanor had nodded once and said thank you and left the room. And the following morning, she had appeared at breakfast with something slightly different about her face. Not lighter, exactly. Not transformed. Something more like a woman who had been carrying a very heavy thing in her right hand for 40 years and had shifted it to the left. The weight was still there. It was simply being held differently. Bess was there. Mr. Graves, who had unbent so much in recent weeks that he had actually offered Clara a spontaneous opinion about the garden layout, which Clara had responded to with such genuine interest that he had offered 2 more. The groundskeeper and his son, who had finally, after 6 weeks of sustained effort, convinced the barn cat to sit on command, though only for bacon. Mrs. Forsythe was there. She had not been invited. Exactly, the invitations had been small and specific, but she had appeared at the church door that morning with a wrapped parcel and the expression of a woman who intended to attend and considered the absence of an invitation a logistical detail rather than an indication of intent. Clara had let her in. It seemed consistent. The ceremony was short and honest. Her father performed it. He was not coughing this morning. He had not been coughing, she realized, for the past several weeks since the roof had been repaired and the damp in the walls had started to clear. She had not let herself think too carefully about this, about how long the cold building had been working on his lungs, because the practical part of her mind said it was important not to think about things she could not have changed. She thought about it now briefly and then let it go. He spoke about honesty. He spoke about the specific daily courage required to love someone without performance, to see them clearly and be seen clearly in return, and to choose that clarity over and over in the small ordinary moments that made up an actual life. He said that love built on what people truly were was the only kind that could survive what life genuinely brought. Because everything else was an agreement between 2 performances, and performances ended. Gabriel stood beside Clara and listened to this with the complete, undefended attention she had come to understand was his real self in full expression. He did not look like a duke this morning. He looked like a man at the beginning of something he had been moving toward for a long time without knowing it. When her father finished speaking and the moment came, Gabriel turned to Clara and held both her hands and looked at her with his whole unperformed face and said the words with a directness that had nothing managed about it. Clara said hers the same way: no performance, no decoration. Just the true thing plainly stated in her father's church, with the September light coming through the new windows. It was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough. The first morning after, Clara came down before Gabriel and made the coffee herself. She made it the way she had learned he preferred, strong enough to justify the cup, none of the ceremony that the household staff usually applied to it, just the thing itself. She put it on the table in the morning room at his place and sat at her own place with her book and waited. He came down 20 minutes later, still pulling his coat straight, slightly less composed than he usually was before 10 in the morning, which was something she had noticed in their weeks of early morning conversations and found entirely endearing. He stopped when he saw the coffee. "You made it," he said. "I know how you take it," she said. He sat down. He drank the coffee. He made the sound of a man who has been handed exactly what he needed without having to ask for it, which was a sound Clara suspected she would spend a considerable portion of her life working to produce. "The stonemason finishes the inscription today," he said. "I know," she said. "I confirmed it with him yesterday." "By truth we endure," he said. "That's what it should always have said," she said. He looked at her over the coffee cup. "Are you going to correct the motto every time someone gets it wrong?" "Until no one gets it wrong anymore," she said. "Yes." "That could take years," he said. "I have time," she said. He almost smiled. She looked at her book. They sat in the morning room in the September light, and the coffee went warm between them, and from somewhere in the east wing came the sound of Eleanor's footsteps, steady, deliberate, and 2 degrees less guarded than they had been a month ago. They were not a family without damage. Clara was clear-eyed enough to know that the damage was real and that repair was not the same as undoing. Eleanor had spent 40 years building walls that would not come down in a season. Gabriel had spent 30 years performing a self that would need careful, deliberate dismantling. Clara herself had spent a lifetime holding her breath in rooms that were not hers, and she was still learning what it felt like to breathe. None of it was finished, none of it was simple, but the roof no longer leaked. The inscription above the library door was being corrected letter by a stonemason who had been told to take his time and do it right. The seed cake was on the table every morning without anyone having to ask. The 4th floorboard in the east corridor still creaked and would probably always creak, and Clara had decided she did not want it fixed. It was, she thought, useful information, and she had always been a woman who valued useful information over comfortable silence. Her father was not coughing. Gabriel set down his coffee cup and opened the paper and read 2 lines of it, and then put it down and looked at Clara instead, because she was more interesting than the paper, and she knew this, and she let him look. "What are you reading?" he said. "Marcus Aurelius," she said. "The same edition as your father. Different copy," she said. "Someone put it in my chair in the morning room 3 days after I arrived. I looked everywhere for an inscription. Most people write their name in a book when they give it, but there wasn't one." Gabriel said nothing. He picked up his coffee cup again. "Gabriel," Clara said. He said. "Did you put the Marcus Aurelius in my chair?" A pause. "I may have noticed you were reading from a very worn copy," he said, "and thought you might appreciate a less structurally compromised version." "You gave me a book," she said, 3 days into my stay without putting your name in it." "I didn't want to presume," he said. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You," she said, "moved my chair, sent the seed cake, gave me the book, and stood outside my door at midnight, all without saying a single word about any of it." "I was being subtle," he said. "You were catastrophically subtle," she said. "And yet here we are," he said. "And yet here we are," she said. They looked at each other across the morning room table with the coffee between them and the September light coming through the window at exactly the right angle, and the house around them, imperfect and complicated and real, making the ordinary sounds of a place being lived in rather than merely maintained. Eleanor appeared in the doorway a moment later. She looked at the 2 of them and said nothing, and Clara said, "There's coffee." And Eleanor said, "Thank you," and sat down. She accepted the cup Clara poured for her and wrapped both hands around it and looked at the table for a moment, with the expression of a woman assembling herself for another day of the difficult necessary work of becoming less afraid. Then she looked up at Clara and said, "The stonemason sent word. He'll be done by noon." "Good," Clara said. "By truth we endure," Eleanor said. She said it carefully, like a woman trying on the shape of something she had been denying for 40 years and finding that it fit better than she'd feared. "That's what it always said," Clara said. "We just had to look at it clearly." Eleanor held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and drank her coffee. Outside, the Hudson Valley moved through its September morning, the orchards going golden, the river catching the light, the estate roads busy with the particular purposeful activity of a household that had things to do, and the resources to do them, and people inside who had finally imperfectly honestly decided to do them together. Clara Whitmore. Clara Ashford, now though she was still getting accustomed to the weight of the second name, sat in her chair at the morning room table, with her husband on her left and her mother-in-law across from her, and Marcus Aurelius face down at her elbow. And she thought about all the rooms she had been asked to leave, and about this one she had been asked to stay in, and about the difference between those two things. The difference was everything. The difference was exactly everything. Status and title built great houses. Money maintained them. Ambition filled their rooms with everything that looked like significance. But it was honesty, plain costly, inconvenient, and absolutely necessary, that made a house into the thing that people came home to. Clara Whitmore had known that since she was old enough to notice the roofs that leaked, and the inscriptions that said the wrong thing, and the people performing versions of themselves that cost them everything and gave them nothing they actually needed. She had simply spent her whole life waiting for a house brave enough to let her fix what was broken. She had found it, and she intended to stay.